Hey everyone! Tonight we're not starting with a philosopher or a ruler, but with something far trickier and more unpredictable: dating in the Middle Ages. Believe it or not, navigating love back then, with plagues, dowries, and ever-watchful chaperones, was somehow even more awkward than sending a 2 a.m. "What you doing?" text. From courtly love ballads to marriage deals sealed with livestock, medieval romance was less about butterflies and more about land and power. Before we dive in, take a moment to hit like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content. And drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining in from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for some gentle background noise, and let's settle in for tonight's journey. Imagine you're standing in a medieval village, or maybe a drafty stone castle, wondering how on earth to find love. Maybe you think about striking up a conversation, complimenting someone's hose, or casually asking, "Do you come here often?" Nope, that's not how it works at all. Modern-style dating didn't exist. You didn't flirt, text, or stroll to see what happens. Instead, your parents, your lord, or even your abbot were already deciding who you'd marry, when, and how many cows it would take to seal the agreement. If you were a noble, chances are you'd been betrothed before your voice even dropped. You might meet your future spouse for the first time on your wedding day. Yes, it was as awkward as it sounds. Everything revolved around land, titles, and family alliances, not compatibility or who's better at dungeon raids. For peasants, things were a bit less formal, but only just. Your family still had the final say, and love wasn't really the focus. Maybe your parents knew a good girl whose family owned a productive goat, or admired a boy who could thatch a roof without falling off. Congratulations, that's your version of courtship. People in the Middle Ages did feel romantic, of course, but romance was rarely the priority. Survival, inheritance, and social stability came first. Falling in love before marriage. Risky. Falling in love outside of marriage. Scandalous. Either way, it wasn't looked kindly upon, unless, of course, you were a character in a tragic poem, in which case, go ahead and get dramatic. And yet, you dream. Maybe you scribble a little poem on a scrap of parchment. Maybe you steal a glance across the market square. Maybe, just maybe, you fall for someone your family's livestock accountant hasn't pre-approved. But for now, you wait. You follow the rules. You try not to fall for the miller's apprentice. Because in this world, love might be the province of poets, but marriage is the business of parents, priests, and politics. So, you notice someone. Maybe it's the way they balance a basket of onions on their head. Maybe it's the confident way they beat mud off a rug. Your medieval heart skips a beat. But hold on, because romance here doesn't grow without a balance sheet. Before you even think about wooing, you need to ask yourself, what do I bring to the table? And if your answer is merely charm, you might want to sit down. If you're a young man, you'll need land, livestock, tools, or at least a roof that doesn't leak too badly. Love letters are sweet, but nothing says husband material like 2 healthy oxen and a shelter that can survive a light storm. And if your father's already promised the best goat to your brother, well, maybe consider the priesthood. If you're a young woman, your family will need a dowry. That could be money, fine clothes, or a suspiciously generous number of geese. No matter how witty you are, if your family can't deliver, you're likely to spend years perfecting embroidery in solitude. Now, let's say you genuinely like someone who makes your calloused heart flutter. You lock eyes at the well. There's a spark. It's romantic, it's poetic, and completely irrelevant, because unless your families are financially aligned, you might as well fall in love with a cloud. If you're noble, things get even worse. Your hand in marriage is tied to land, borders, and political favors. You're not just a person, you're a walking treaty. Congratulations. Even peasants aren't spared. Marriage is practical. You don't marry for butterflies. You marry because your pig pen borders someone else's wheat field. You dream of passion, but practicality always wins. You settle for irrigation rights. And yet, you try. Maybe you offer a small token, a carved wooden spoon, a handful of berries, or your finest slightly cracked mug. Maybe they smile, maybe they don't. But the reality is clear. In medieval dating, economics is the true flirtation, and love is just a hopeful bonus you pray your spouse eventually develops. Now, let's say you're not a peasant fretting over pigs, or a noble tangled in treaties. Let's say you're a knight. Shiny armor, mighty steed, questionable poetry skills. What's your love life like? Welcome to the bizarre and emotionally exhausting world of courtly love. This isn't dating, it's performance art. Courtly love was a noble pastime, part flirtation, part spiritual torment, and entirely impractical. You, the valiant knight, select a noble lady, often one who's already married, and vow to adore her from afar. Physical contact is strictly forbidden. That would ruin everything. Instead, you must suffer with elegance. You might compose a few tortured verses about her silver laughter or how her hair shines like the sun, which in medieval terms mostly means she has hair and didn't insult your family. You wear her colors in tournaments, you pine, you sigh. Occasionally, you might challenge a rival to a joust simply because he dared glance at her too long. The lady's role? She is meant to act as though all this is flattering while maintaining a level of icy detachment that could freeze a glacier. She may respond with a letter, a small token, maybe a ribbon, but mostly, she remains mysterious and unattainable because that is the entire point. The emotions are intense, the physical contact minimal. At best, you might receive a nod across the hall or a fingertip brushing your gauntlet at a feast. Anything more, and it's no longer courtly love, it's scandal, or worse, adultery. And no one wants that, at least officially. This whole arrangement worked best when everyone understood it was mostly pretend. It allowed people to express longing, devotion, and creative angst without disrupting the social order, a kind of medieval venting system. Dramatic? Absolutely. More poetry than practicality? Always. But on a night caught between battles and boredom, courtly love gave you something to write about and someone to write for. Just don't expect a happy ending, a kiss, or even meaningful eye contact. So, you've fallen for someone. Wonderful. Now comes the tricky part. Expressing that affection in a society where touching someone's hand without a chaperone is basically a declaration of war. Enter the medieval solution: tokens. Think of it as 12th century texting, slow, confusing, and prone to wildly inaccurate interpretations. Let's say you're a knight, hopelessly in love with Lady Marguerite of someplace or other. You can't speak to her alone, and your poems keep getting intercepted by her confessor. What do? You send her a glove, or maybe an embroidered sleeve. Nothing says, "I love you," like mailing someone a piece of your wardrobe. And if you're the lucky recipient, congratulations. You now have a slightly sweaty linen sleeve you didn't ask for, along with the romantic headache of pretending you understand its meaning. Is he confessing love? Asking a favor? Suggesting a jewel? Who can tell? Women gave tokens too. A ribbon, a lock of hair, a tiny pendant. Sentimental? Yes, but also highly strategic. Give the wrong token to the wrong person, and suddenly you're spoken for by someone with a lazy eye and a fondness for ale. Tokens were meant to be subtle. A glove pinned to your chest, a ribbon tied to your sword hilt. Everyone knew the significance, yet no one ever said it outright. The more cryptic, the better. This glove? Oh no, it's not from Lady Joan. It just appeared on my pillow, lightly scented with lavender, completely by chance. For commoners, tokens were simpler: a small wood carving or a handkerchief stitched during downtime between chores. Still romantic, just with more calluses. Tokens were also risky. Giving one to the wrong person could spark rumors. Receiving one you didn't want meant figuring out how to politely return someone's sock without insulting their family. Yet for all the awkwardness, these tokens carried genuine emotional weight. They were symbols of love in a world that allowed very little of it. Finally, you summon the courage to speak to your crush. Perhaps you offer a flower. Perhaps you recite a line of awkward poetry that, yes, you definitely didn't copy from a passing minstrel. You're ready for a moment of intimacy. Too bad you're never truly alone. Welcome to the world of medieval dating surveillance, where love is never private. It's constantly monitored by your mother, your priest, a nosy cousin, or sometimes all three at once. Let's say you're a young woman of marriageable age. You're never just going for a walk. You're going for a walk with Margaret and her terrifyingly strict aunt, already scrutinizing your posture. Even a simple trip to fetch water comes with an audience. Someone is always watching. It's less dating and more espionage. If you're a man trying to court someone, better hope you have the blessing of her family, her parish priest, and the local gossip network. You show up at her house with flowers. Her father is lurking behind the door sharpening something. Her mother pretends to stir a pot that hasn't boiled in 3 hours. And the village priest just happens to be passing by on his way to morning prayers at sunset. The logic behind all this supervision was simple. Protect virtue, preserve family honor, and absolutely prevent any unsanctioned touching, especially before marriage, especially alone, and especially ever. Chaperones were there to ensure every innocent interaction was observed, group outings monitored, walks supervised, sitting within 2 meters of each other on a bench only if a grandmother happened to be knitting nearby and pretending not to listen. The church, of course, had plenty to say. It regulated courtship the way a nightclub bouncer regulates entry. Priests preached about proper conduct and even wrote long treatises warning of the dangers of flirtation. That's right, medieval clergy published anti-flirting manuals. Imagine copying one of those by candlelight while monks silently judge you from across the scriptorium. Even letter writing wasn't safe. Some monasteries opened love letters just to screen them for moral content. Divine censorship, essentially. So, if you want to fall in love, you'd better get used to doing it quietly, in the presence of your entire extended family and possibly God. You're in love, or at least medieval in love, which mostly consists of longing, confusion, and pacing near windows. You've exchanged glances across a feast. Maybe they picked up your dropped handkerchief instead of tossing it into the fire. The tension is unbearable, but speaking freely? Not an option. There are chaperones, priests, and mothers lurking like emotional border patrol agents. So what do? You write a letter. Ah yes, the secret love letter. Possibly the most dangerous piece of parchment since an excommunication notice. This is your chance to pour out your heart using the most cryptic, overly poetic language imaginable. You can't simply write, "I like you." No, you must declare, "My soul is a stag pierced by the arrow of your grace, roaming the forests of yearning." Naturally, literacy isn't guaranteed. If you can read and write, you scrawl your message on vellum or coarse parchment. If you're really committed, you might sprinkle flower petals or perfume over it. But caution is key. One noble once wrapped a herring in a love letter and delivered it to the wrong girl. They're married now. Somehow. Delivery is another challenge. You can't just hand it over yourself. You need a courier, a loyal servant, a bribed monk, or a younger sibling blissfully unaware of the consequences. Sometimes even a minstrel could handle it, singing your poem in the town square while claiming anonymity. Risky business. Very risky. The line between romantic and heretical was thinner than a Lenten wafer. If your metaphor hinted at anything physical, you might end up confessing to both lust and poetic exaggeration. Despite all the rules, people still wrote. Some letters survived. Some poems were copied and passed around like forbidden fruit. In a world of rigid schedules and constant supervision, a folded scrap of words could feel revolutionary. You write. You take the risk, pressing your trembling hand to the parchment, saying all the things you cannot speak aloud. Just don't sign it too clearly. You want romance, not a church trial. Then comes a rare reprieve, a feast day, a harvest festival, a maple dance. In other words, a brief moment when life isn't only work, prayer, and pretending not to notice the blacksmith's daughter. Today, you are allowed to flirt. Kind of. As long as no one sees, or everyone sees, but pretends they don't. Welcome to medieval festivals, where romance blossoms under the watchful eyes of everyone you've ever met and 3 chickens. Festivals were one of the few socially sanctioned occasions when men and women could mingle, laugh, and yes, dare to make eye contact. There's music, there's ale, and someone strutting around in a flower crown with alarming confidence. You've never seen so many people genuinely enjoying themselves. If you're a peasant, Impressing your crush might involve winning the sack race, catching a greased pig, or juggling 3 slightly stale rolls of bread. Nothing says, "I'm available," quite like tumbling off a hay bale with as much dignity as you can muster. Dancing offered your best chance at actual physical contact. The rules were strict, but a well-timed spin or a carefully grazed hand could convey far more than any poem. The maple dance, for instance, was essentially a large-scale excuse for coordinated flirting, cleverly disguised with ribbons and plausible deniability. If you're noble, your festival flirting involved less hay and more poetry. You might improvise a verse on the spot, compare your lady's eyes to twin candles or other glowing objects, and offer a small trinket, ideally not something clearly crafted by your servant 5 minutes prior. Food also helped. Offer a meat pie or a slice of honey cake. If they accept with a smile, you're doing well. If they toss it to their dog, it's back to square one. Remember, though, someone is always watching. A parent, a priest, a bard with an overactive mouth. One misstep and your playful smile becomes a youthful indiscretion dissected at church for 6 weeks straight. Still, for a few fleeting hours, you can pretend. Pretend that love isn't a transaction, laughter isn't suspicious, and dancing in public doesn't end in penance. Now, let's say you're not a knight, a noble, or a bard with a penchant for excessive feelings. You're a regular villager. You wake with the cows, sleep with the chickens, and spend your days ankle-deep in mud. You're not searching for a poetic soulmate. You're looking for someone who can milk a goat without emotional drama. Welcome to peasant courtship. Romance is practical, gestures are modest, and chemistry means surviving winter together. In this world, dating is less about long conversations and more about shared labor. You notice someone because they work hard, complain little, and have decent teeth. That's it. That's your entire checklist. You're not picky. You're practical. You don't need fireworks. You need someone who can get a fish and maybe doesn't snore too loudly. So, how do you show interest? You give small, useful gifts, a basket of eggs, a bundle of firewood, a sturdy turnip. Feeling adventurous? Maybe a woven ribbon or a carved wooden spoon. Nothing says, "I'm serious about you," quite like a spoon you whittled by candlelight while your pig judged you silently. Conversations happen during shared chores. You might walk together to the mill, chat while tending sheep, or exchange small talk while shoveling something suspiciously odorous. No one's reciting poetry here. You're talking about the weather, crop yields, and whether old Thomas fell in the well again. And yet, in its own way, it's romantic. There's a sweetness in the simplicity, a shared life built not on idealism, but on cooperation. You learn each other's strengths, weaknesses, and how fast they run when a goat escapes. Proposals were often quick. If both of you agreed, and so did your families, marriage followed. Maybe you moved into an existing hut. Maybe you built a new one together with help from the village. You brought your best blanket. They brought a goat. Together, you embarked on the strange miracle of domestic survival. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. You found someone who can cook, clean, tolerate your family, and doesn't flinch at the sight of your feet. True love, right? Now comes the wedding, which in medieval terms is a contract, not a dreamy vow under the stars. A legally binding transaction, often negotiated with the same intensity as a livestock auction. For peasants, it's still serious business. You gather witnesses, speak with the local priest, and try not to stumble over the Latin. Behind the sweet-sounding blessings lies a strict checklist: dowry, land rights, who gets the cow, and what happens if someone dies during planting season. Ah yes, romance. For the upper class, buckle up. Marriage is a full-blown legal negotiation. Parents, priests, scribes, maybe a cousin who dabbled in law. They're all involved. The bride and groom mostly stand nearby, looking decorative and nodding when spoken to. You may not have even met the person you're marrying. Your family has done the math. Your estate needs her fields. Her dowry balances your debts. And both of your coats of arms look quite fetching side by side. Love? Optional. The merger? Not optional. And once you're married, it's permanent. Divorce isn't really a thing, unless you can prove someone wasn't baptized, secretly related to you, or died and forgot to mention it. Annulments existed, but they required mountains of paperwork, a bit of luck, and a generous bribe. Still, not everything was grim. Some couples genuinely grew to love each other through shared chores, raising children, and surviving harsh winters. These things built affection, or at least tolerance, which in medieval terms is basically the same thing. The church was involved at every step. Marriage was a holy sacrament, one of the big seven. You didn't just marry for legal reasons. You married because God needed a witness, possibly two. So you stand there, exchange vows, and smile as someone hands over a sack of onions and calls it a blessing. Now, let's say you've had enough. Enough contracts, enough negotiations, enough being treated like a particularly valuable sack of flour. You're a noble, but this time you want to marry for love, not for land, not for lineage, not to satisfy your father's political schemes, just love. Congratulations, you're about to cause a scandal. Noble elopements were the medieval equivalent of setting your family tree on fire and dancing in the ashes. Suppose your lady Elenina, promised to a suborning Vaughan estate secure, but hopelessly in love with a penniless squire who smells faintly of horses and adventure. You meet in secret, whisper sweet nothings in the stables, and one day vanish to a monastery where the abbot owes you a favor. There, you marry under questionable legality with only a nervous monk and 2 chickens as witnesses. Back home, chaos reigns. Your family is outraged. Your father threatens to besiege the groom's garden. Your mother sobs into her embroidery hoop. The church is deeply concerned. And the gossip? Delicious. If you're the groom in this romantic rebellion, don't get too comfortable. Best case scenario, you keep your bride and your kneecaps. Worst case scenario, you're excommunicated and disemboweled, probably in that order. Still, some couples manage to pull it off. If a union couldn't be undone without causing even more embarrassment, families sometimes just shrugged and moved on. After all, what's done is done, and at least nobody died. Hopefully. In rare cases, these scandals became legendary. Songs were written, poems composed, and stories whispered at banquets. 2 nobles choosing love over duty. Practically mythological. And yes, most noble marriages were purely transactional. But these fleeting rebellions, passionate escapes, whispered vows beneath moonlit towers, reminded the world that love, though inconvenient, refused to vanish entirely. So, if you ever feel dramatic for swiping left or declining a second date, just remember, at least your love life doesn't involve secret weddings, furious barons, and a horse tied to a ladder outside your window. Marriage, a beautiful union of 2 souls, and their respective financial portfolios. In the Middle Ages, love was charming, but a dowry? Now that was true romance. Let's say you're a bride. You're not just marrying. You're being launched like a small, economic vessel equipped with a dowry. Your family prepares your offerings. Money, livestock, land, linens, a cow or 2 depending on how much they adore you, and maybe even a set of pewter dishes if they're feeling generous. These gifts go to your future husband, who receives both you and your portable wealth with open arms and a mental abacus. Now, flip the scenario. In some regions, it's not the bride's family giving gifts, it's a bride price. The groom pays her family for the honor of marrying her, effectively saying, "Here's a horse, a cloak, and 3 pigs. Now give me your daughter." Medieval romance at its finest. The point is, someone is paying someone. You're marrying, and there's absolutely a receipt involved. These exchanges weren't just about money. They were statements of status, expectations, and public declaration. A generous dowry might indicate a prestigious family. A stingy one? Perhaps the family was eager to offload the bride quickly, maybe due to a sharp tongue or a habit of arguing back. As the bride, you didn't usually keep your dowry. It became part of the household economy, managed by your husband, protected by the law, and hopefully not gambled away on dice and ale within the first month of marriage. If a marriage ended through death, annulment, or your husband wandering off to join a monastery midlife, you could theoretically reclaim your dowry. But retrieving it was often harder than drawing a sword from a stone. You needed allies, legal backing, and ideally someone who could read. Meanwhile, The bride price, if already paid, was like buying a rare goat, costly up front and non-refundable. It compensated the bride's family for the loss of her labor. After all, who's going to milk the sheep now? So, while love sometimes played a role, money was always present at the altar. Maybe marriage wasn't your path. Perhaps you were a second son, your dowry suspiciously small, or you just really enjoyed chanting. In any case, you joined a monastery or convent. Congratulations! You've now taken vows of poverty, chastity, and a rigorous disinterest in romance. And yet, here you are, in a stone cloister surrounded by silence, candle smoke, and Brother Anselm's unexpectedly soulful eyes. Even behind monastery walls, forbidden love found a way. To be clear, falling in love in a religious order was highly discouraged. You could face whipping, exile, or a stern lecture from someone with a Latin name. You'd sworn to give your heart entirely to God, which meant literally no one else. But hearts are stubborn, and sometimes prayers start sounding a lot like love poems. It often began innocently, passing bread to one another in the refectory, whispering during vespers, laughing a little too hard when someone dropped a hymnal. Before long, you're slipping extra cheese into Sister Beatrice's satchel and questioning everything. Some monks and nuns even wrote passionate letters, disguised, of course, as theological reflections. Your soul is a shining light in the darkness of my contemplation. Sounds holy, until you read between the lines. Naturally, scandals followed. Secret meetings in the herb garden, midnight confessions that weren't strictly sacramental, and the occasional gasp-worthy discovery of a nun with a suspiciously round belly. Punishments were harsh: exile, public penance, or reassignment to a remote abbey famous only for sheep and silence. Still, not every story ended in disgrace. Some lovers managed to escape. A few even married after being defrocked. Most, however, returned to their cloisters, cheeks red and hearts rededicated, swearing the whole affair had been nothing more than an overzealous theological debate. After all, monastic life was about discipline. But humans are humans, even in robes, even in silence. Sometimes a quiet glance across the chapel was more thrilling than any tournament or courtly poem. You did it. You got married. There was a priest, a pig roast, and someone spilled mead on your mother's only fine cloak. But now, months or years later, something feels off. Maybe your spouse snores like a dying lute. Maybe they conveniently forgot to mention their chronic gambling problem. Or perhaps you've realized that marrying for land and sheep doesn't guarantee romantic bliss. Welcome to the world of medieval marital disappointment. Don't reach for divorce papers. They don't exist, at least not in any form you'd recognize. Marriage was a sacred, unbreakable bond approved by the church, blessed by God, and enforced by public shame. Annulments were possible, but only for very specific reasons. We don't get along didn't count. You'd need proof. One spouse was underage, already married, too closely related, which happened disturbingly often. Or, best-case scenario, the marriage had never been consummated, something that required a written confirmation, possibly under oath. Good luck with that. For nobles, it was even messier. Your marriage wasn't just personal, it was political. Trying to escape, it could spark a feud, ignite a scandal, or start a minor war. The safest option? Quietly resent each other and attend separate feasts. So what did unhappy couples do? Mostly they endured. Sleeping in separate beds, sighing dramatically at meals, pouring feelings into embroidery or one particularly angry psalm. Passive aggression became their love language. Of course, affairs happened, usually discreetly, sometimes spectacularly. Nobles had secret lovers. Peasants had suspiciously helpful neighbors. The church condemned it, naturally, but that didn't stop anyone. It just made them better at sneaking around barns and blaming mishaps on God's mysterious will. For women, escaping a bad marriage was especially difficult. Even if your husband was abusive or vanished entirely, society expected you to remain loyal, silent, and mildly pious while subsisting on bread crusts and universal disapproval. Still, some people made it work. Marriages weren't always joyful. but they could become partnerships forged by hardship, habit, and the shared labor of hauling firewood in the rain. Now, suppose your spouse dies. Perhaps it was the plague. Perhaps a farm accident. Perhaps they tripped over a goose in the dark. However it happened, you're now widowed, and suddenly, the medieval dating pool reopens. Being a widow in the Middle Ages was oddly liberating. Not full do whatever you want freedom, but certainly more autonomy than you'd had before. For women, widowhood often brought a taste of independence, managing land, making decisions, even speaking in public without being immediately shushed. And if you were youngish and still had teeth, remarriage could come quickly, very quickly. Survival instincts existed alongside mourning. A widow with land and no husband was essentially a walking treasure chest. Suitors arrived with alarming speed, some sincere, some simply very interested in your dairy cows. If you were a widowed man, society practically nudged you back into marriage. Who else would cook, clean, and raise the 11 children you somehow amassed? So, you start searching, maybe the baker's daughter, maybe that quiet widow with suspiciously excellent meat at the market. Romance in second marriages could be surprisingly sweet. This time, you're older, wiser. You're not being forced into an alliance. You're choosing someone to survive with. Maybe even someone you genuinely like. Wild concept. Of course, there were rules. The church frowned on remarriage that happened too quickly. Like, your spouse isn't cold yet, quickly. Widows often had to negotiate dowries and inheritance with family. Nothing says romantic second chance, like arguing with your brother-in-law over who keeps the butter churn. Still, second marriages were common, even expected. Life was short, and winters were long. No one wanted to endure life entirely alone if they could avoid it. And yes, love was always part of the mix. Perhaps not the swooning, sonnet-scrawling, moonlit kissing kind you might imagine. Rather, it was quieter, subtler, a feeling rooted in shared experience, mutual respect, and the recognition that both of you had already witnessed more than your fair share of misfortune. It was the kind of love that blossomed not in candlelight serenades or under gilded chandeliers, but over a shared loaf of bread, a fire rekindled at dusk, and the simple understanding that another human being was willing to shoulder the burdens of survival beside you. So, you light the fire, pour the soup, and try again. Not because life is perfect, but because it is human. You've survived the contracts, the chaperones, the awkward courtships, the risky barn elopements, and perhaps even the plague. You've learned the art of patience, compromise, and subtle glances over crowded feasts. But before you fall in love anew, before your heart leaps at another smile or fleeting touch, the medieval mind forces you to ask a question that today sounds absurd. Are you cosmically permitted to love this person? Yes. Medieval love wasn't just a matter of hearts and inclinations. It was a question of stars, bones, family gossip, and sometimes whether your grandmother happened to see a fox that morning. Astrology played a major role. Before even daring a kiss, one might consult the local monk astrologer, who would examine your birth charts, the alignment of Venus and Jupiter, and the fates cast by the moon. Were your signs compatible? Was your beloved born under an ill-fated phase of Mars? Were you, perchance, doomed to be wed to a person cursed by a retrograde Mercury? If so, it was considered far wiser to choose someone less astrologically compromised. Love was already complicated enough. Why tempt the heavens? Superstitions extended far beyond astrology. Birthmarks, mysterious symbols, and peculiar scars might be interpreted as cosmic indicators of your destined soulmate, or, conversely, your inevitable executioner. The universe was a subtle prankster, and interpretations were flexible, shaped by local lore and opportunistic neighbors. And the church had its own strictures. Marriage between close relatives was forbidden without ecclesiastical dispensation, a rule that applied to cousins, second cousins, or even fourth cousins twice removed. Wealthy families often purchased permissions to bypass such constraints, exploiting loopholes and bending the rigid lines of kinship as needed. Drawing a family tree and quietly erasing inconvenient branches was as much part of matchmaking as choosing a dowry or presenting your finest pig. Social hierarchy mattered deeply. A nobleman could not freely fall in love with a peasant without society interpreting it as either a miracle or a moral failing. Cross-class romance was rare, scandalous, and only retrospectively deemed acceptable if it became immortalized in a tragic folk ballad. Omens guided courtship as well. A raven flying overhead while you were thinking of someone? A bad sign. Dropping bread while casting a furtive glance at your crush during supper? A cursed union, undoubtedly. Charms buried beneath doorsteps, herbs hung in doorways, and whispered advice from eccentric village seers all contributed to the invisible regulatory framework of medieval love. Despite these signs, rules, and whispered warnings, people still loved, clumsily, audaciously, and frequently against the advice of astrologers, priests, and meddling grandmothers. Hearts remained stubbornly disobedient, even when bound by contracts, dowries, and celestial alignments. This understanding of love, superstition, and human desire sets the stage for stories that stretch beyond personal affairs and into the realm of legend. Consider the story of Tamaris, sometimes spelled Tomarus, a woman whose courage, cunning, and martial prowess defied the conventions of her age. You may have heard of Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, but Tamaris is less well known, even though her deeds were astonishing. She did not reign from gilded thrones within fortified cities. Her authority was not granted by birthright alone, nor by the ceremonies of a court. Her dominion was the open steppe, her army the wind and the horse, her power forged through sheer grit, leadership, and an unshakable aura of authority. Tamaris was queen of the Masajte, a confederation of nomadic tribes roaming the vast grasslands of Central Asia. Think horse archers, tattooed warriors, ritual feasts, and battlefield justice administered with lightning decisiveness. Her rise was not a product of inherited power or pampered courtiers. It was earned, fought for, and maintained by respect and fear alike. Her people endured brutal winters, long migrations, and constant threats from rival tribes, yet Tamaris stood out among them. She was a warrior, a lawgiver, and a sovereign in her own right. No husband overshadowed her. No brother dictated her decisions. Much of what we know about Tamaris comes from Herodotus, the Greek historian, a man whose accounts often mingled fact, folklore, and a flair for the dramatic. Yet, even if only a portion of his tales are true, they portray a figure who was essentially a storm in human form, commanding, decisive, and untamed. Her story unfolds against the backdrop of rising empires and shifting powers. The Persian Empire, under Cyrus the Great, was expanding rapidly. Lydia and Babylon had already fallen under his rule, and now his gaze turned eastward. The Masajte, led by Tamaris, were next. Cyrus, a conqueror of unparalleled renown, expected compliance, or at least, he anticipated minimal resistance. He had toppled cities with ease and commanded the loyalty of vast armies. So when he approached the lands of the Masajte, he sent the customary diplomatic offer, a political marriage proposal. This was standard imperial protocol, a method to secure peace without spilling blood. He proposed marrying Tamaris himself, a union designed to absorb her territory into the Persian fold. Romance, in the form we understand it, played no part in his calculation. For Tamaris, however, the proposal was not flattering. It was a test, a challenge, and an insult all at once. She recognized immediately that this was no offer of affection, but a bid for subjugation. She saw the underlying message: submit, yield your sovereignty, and accept a fate designed by a distant emperor who had never crossed the steppes on horseback. Tamaris' response was decisive. She rejected Cyrus outright, setting into motion events that would become legendary. She marshaled her forces, prepared her warriors, and strategized a defense, not for conquest, but for survival and autonomy. Her actions were not merely reactive, they were proactive. She understood the stakes. Failure would mean the loss of freedom for her people and potentially the end of her own reign. Before a single arrow was loosed, before any spear shattered against shield or armor, She had already assumed command of the battlefield. Her opposition to Cyrus highlights a key principle. She was a ruler unbound by conventional expectations. Unlike many women of her time, she wielded power directly, without male intercession. Her authority derived from competence, courage, and charisma, rather than ceremony or inheritance. Her army, composed of nomadic warriors skilled in horse archery and mobile tactics, responded to her leadership because it was earned. Her people had witnessed her ability to govern, to protect, and to inspire. The confrontation with Cyrus was inevitable. The Persian forces, seasoned by campaigns across Babylon and Lydia, encountered the Massagetæ in a land that demanded both endurance and tactical ingenuity. Tamaris exploited her understanding of terrain, mobility, and the psychology of her enemy. She orchestrated maneuvers that bewildered the invaders, leading to a climactic confrontation in which Cyrus himself met an unexpected fate. According to Herodotus, Tamaris' army managed to ambush and ultimately slay Cyrus, decapitating him and securing a temporary, though momentous, victory for her people. This episode illustrates the extraordinary capacity of a single determined individual to alter the course of history. Tamaris' story serves as a counterpoint to the male-dominated narratives of empire and conquest. She was not merely a figure of legend, but a demonstration of leadership, strategy, and indomitable will. Her life exemplifies how personal courage and tactical genius can override traditional expectations and societal constraints. Her legacy extends beyond military achievement. Tamaris' defiance challenged contemporary notions of female authority and the limitations imposed by patriarchal structures. In a world where women were often relegated to domestic or symbolic roles, she stood as a sovereign in her own right, commanding respect through action rather than decree. Her story resonates because it intertwines personal agency, political acumen, and martial skill, a trifecta rarely attributed to women in historical chronicles. Tamaris knew exactly what was at stake. This was never a matter of love, nor was it even about forming an alliance. It was entirely, unflinchingly, about control. Accepting Cyrus' marriage proposal would have transformed her kingdom into just another satrapy of the Persian Empire, and she would have been reduced to nothing more than a decorative trophy queen, her sovereignty stripped under the guise of diplomatic courtesy. She rejected the offer without hesitation. Cyrus, a man accustomed to obedience, charm, and submission, did not respond kindly to refusal. His pride stung. If persuasion failed, he resolved to use force. Without delay, he crossed the Araxes River, which marked the boundary between the Persian Empire and the lands of the Massagetæ, establishing a foothold on her territory. But Tamaris was not idle. She mobilized swiftly, gathering her warriors, consulting with tribal elders, and devising a strategy. She knew what was coming, and she would not allow her people to be caught unprepared. This was a queen who understood that preparation could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Cyrus, aided by his general Harpagus, attempted subterfuge. A portion of his army remained behind, encamped luxuriously with wine, rich foods, and other decadent provisions that nomadic peoples rarely saw or indulged in. It was bait, carefully laid. Tamaris' son, Sparapises, led a detachment of Massagetæ warriors to raid this camp, seizing the supplies and, unfortunately, falling victim to the wine's intoxicating effects. When the Persians returned, their troops found Sparapises' forces disoriented and exhausted. Overpowered, Sparapises was captured alive. The news of her son's capture shattered Tamaris. This was not merely a military setback, it was a personal tragedy. She sent an urgent message to Cyrus: "Return my son and withdraw from my lands. Refuse, and I swear by the heavens and the sun that you will pay with blood." Cyrus ignored her warning. Humiliated by his capture, Sparapises ultimately took his own life in captivity, leaving Tamaris bereft and enraged. Her grief was fierce, and it transformed into a searing, almost elemental fury. Tamaris' response was immediate and uncompromising. This was no longer about defending borders or political prestige. It was about vengeance. She would face Cyrus directly, and she would ensure that he, and anyone aligned with him, understood the cost of defying her. She mounted her horse, sharpened her weapons, and took an oath that would resonate through history. She would avenge her son, defeat Cyrus, and make her mark indelibly upon the world. As Herodotus recounts, Tamaris summoned the tribal council of the Massagetæ. Hundreds of warriors assembled under her command, ready for battle. These were horse archers, warriors in leather armor, painted faces showing determination and rage. They moved like a storm across the plains, not in the rigid formations of the Persian army, but as a torrent of speed, cunning, and deadly precision. Tamaris studied Cyrus' tactics, observed his weaknesses, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. When the two armies finally clashed, the battle was unlike any conventional engagement. There were no formal speeches, no ceremonial heralds. Only the chaos of war, horses screaming, metal clashing against metal, warriors charging and falling, and a queen leading from the front. Tamaris was in the heart of the fray, cutting down enemies with a ferocity that inspired her troops and terrified her adversaries. She was not an ornamental figure, nor a symbolic leader. She was every bit a warrior and strategist, commanding her people with a combination of courage, instinct, and unshakable resolve. In the end, Cyrus the Great fell. According to Herodotus, Tamaris had his body searched, severed his head, and placed it in a wineskin filled with blood as a final offering, declaring, "You thirsted for blood. Now drink your fill." Whether every detail is literal or embellished, the significance remains. She crushed the Persian forces, avenged her son, and established herself as a force impossible to ignore. The victory was not about conquest. Tamaris returned to her people, pragmatic and focused on survival rather than empire building. There were no war taxes, no ambitions to annex Persian territory. Her aim had been justice, not dominion. And yet, the implications were immense. The death of Cyrus sent shockwaves across the known world, from Babylon to Egypt, signaling that even the mightiest empire could be challenged by determined leadership and strategic brilliance. The Massagetæ themselves were remarkable. They were not sedentary, urbanized civilizations like Babylon or Persia. Instead, they were nomadic warriors of the open steppe, surviving through mobility, skill, and communal effort. Horses were currency, herding was essential, and combat was ingrained from childhood. Archery was second nature, and leather and scale armor allowed for swift, flexible movement. Women, too, were warriors by expectation rather than exception, fully participating in defense and raids. In this society, Tamaris' leadership was entirely consistent with cultural norms. She did not defy gender expectations. She embodied them. Their governance emphasized merit and consensus over birthright. Leaders commanded through deeds rather than ceremonial authority. Strength, fairness, and loyalty were the currencies of respect. Religion, based on sun worship and natural cycles, reinforced social cohesion and collective responsibility. Tamaris' rise and triumph reflected not just personal skill, but a society built on shared values and rigorous training. Her story is a study in contrasts. Maternal grief fueling martial precision, personal loss inspiring collective action, and a nomadic queen defying a sprawling empire without the trappings of palace or court. After the battle, she fades from written history. No monuments, no grand tombs, no surviving chronicles beyond Greek accounts. Yet her impact persisted, carried by oral tradition, cultural memory, and the whispered awe of future generations. Even scholars who doubt Herodotus' exact account agree on one point. Persia suffered a massive blow at the hands of a leader who was neither king nor general. Tamaris was a mother, a warrior, a strategist, and above all, a queen whose authority emanated from capability rather than ceremonial recognition. Her tale demonstrates that leadership, courage, and justice are not confined by gender, culture, or expectation. To understand Tamaris fully, one must understand her people. The Massagetæ were not architects of monumental stone structures or chroniclers of elaborate literature. Their world was vast, untamed, and mobile. Children learned to ride before they could walk steadily. Weapons, from compact bows to spears, were extensions of the body. Combat was practical, survival-based, and communal. Women fought alongside men naturally, without ceremony or surprise. Tamara's actions were not exceptional within her society. They were exemplary of the values and training inherent to it. Her victory against Cyrus and the Persian Empire exemplifies the profound impact a single determined leader can exert. It underscores the interplay between personal motivation and collective strength, revealing how intelligence, preparation, and emotional resolve can shape historical outcomes. The power of grief transformed into strategic insight became a tool of liberation and revenge, highlighting the intimate connection between personal and political stakes in leadership. And yet, her story is also deeply human. Victory did not erase loss. Avenging her son did not heal her heart, and the triumph came with its own shadows. Tamara's legend is not of unbridled conquest or empire. It is the tale of a mother and a queen navigating grief, vengeance, and the unyielding demands of leadership. Her narrative exemplifies the complexity of historical figures, especially women, whose deeds often intersected with personal motivation, social expectation, and extraordinary circumstance. Tamaris, queen of the Massagetes, issued a warning to Cyrus that was as vivid as it was terrifying. She swore by the sun, whom her people revered as the supreme arbiter of justice and life, the master of the Massagetes. To Tamaris, the sun was not just a celestial body. It was the divine witness to oaths, the ultimate judge of truth and betrayal. Any promise made under its gaze was sacred, and to break it was tantamount to spitting in the face of the heavens themselves. When she spoke these words, she was not merely a mother pleading for her son, nor a ruler negotiating a military standoff. She was the embodiment of the values her people had cherished for generations: courage, honor, principle, and an unwavering commitment to autonomy. Her defiance was not anomaly, it was archetypal. She was exactly the kind of leader the Massagetes revered, a figure shaped by necessity, steeped in resilience, and defined by an indomitable spirit. While the Persian Empire functioned like a clockwork of bureaucracy, tax officials, and administrative orders, the Massagetes lived in a world of freedom, mobility, and personal accountability. Their authority derived from skill, loyalty, and reputation rather than ceremonial bloodlines or imperial favor. To Cyrus, accustomed to absolute obedience, this was alien territory. The Massagetes were not to be controlled. They existed on their own terms, as fluid and untamed as the plains they roamed. In a brutal confrontation that would echo through history, the open steppe became a theater of freedom asserting itself against empire. For a people raised under endless skies and whipping winds, subjugation was inconceivable. What is striking, however, is the source of everything we know about Tamaris. Our entire understanding of her life, her confrontation with Cyrus, her son's tragic fate, and the infamous wineskin filled with blood comes from a single source: the Greek historian Herodotus. He is lauded as the father of history, yet he was equally a father of hearsay, rumor, and dramatic flourish. Herodotus loved a story. The more spectacular, the better. Divine signs, blood-soaked vengeance, audacious women. That was the stuff of Greek narrative delight. So, how much of Tamaris' story is historically accurate? Scholars debate endlessly. Herodotus wrote decades after the events, likely without ever encountering a Massagetes in person. He relied on travelers, rumors, and second-hand accounts filtered through multiple cultures and agendas. History, for him, was as much performance as record, a tale crafted to instruct, entertain, and immortalize. Yet even through the lens of a dramatist, Tamaris' figure emerges as remarkable. In a world dominated by male rulers, conquerors, and generals, Herodotus preserved the tale of a steppe queen who challenged one of the greatest kings of the ancient world and won. That alone sets her apart. She was not a footnote in Persian history, nor a minor barbarian curiosity. Herodotus ensured that Tamaris' actions, decisions, and courage would outlive even the king she opposed. Why did her story resonate so profoundly? Because it had everything the ancients loved in a narrative: a noble woman of fierce principle, a son whose fate stirred both pity and outrage, an enemy of immense power, a battle for survival, and a resolution that was bloody, decisive, and morally satisfying. Imagine hearing this from a traveling bard in Athens or along the Aegean coast, a queen without a palace, without city walls, who defies the most powerful king on earth. You would remember her, not because of a crown or titles, but because she dared, and she triumphed. Over time, the story evolved. Medieval chroniclers, influenced by European fascination with the exotic, recast her as a savage Amazon, a warrior queen drenched in blood. Renaissance artists turned her into a dramatic icon, holding the severed head of Cyrus as though it were a trophy, or witnessing the decapitated corpse ceremonially dunked into a vessel of wine and blood. Tasteful, perhaps not, but unforgettable. Through centuries of reinterpretation, the essence of Tamaris endured. Her image became malleable, symbolizing the righteous fury of a mother, the fearsome barbarism of nomadic peoples, the autonomy of a ruler who would not be coerced. Writers, painters, philosophers, and playwrights all returned to her story, exploring different facets: maternal love, military genius, or the dangers and glories of female rule. Enlightenment thinkers debated her significance, questioning whether she was evidence that women could govern wisely or a cautionary tale of emotion dictating political action. In every era, she persisted, sometimes vilified, sometimes celebrated, always remembered. Yet ironically, the Massagetæ left little evidence of her reign. No monumental tombs, no inscribed stelae, no gilded monuments. Unlike the Persian kings she defeated, Tamaris' legacy was not enshrined in stone or written decree. It survived through the eyes of outsiders, filtered through myth and legend. And yet, her story continued to reappear. In the Soviet era, Central Asian historians and cultural leaders reclaimed her as a symbol of resistance against imperial conquest. Statues of her were erected in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, not as a queen drenched in blood, but as a legitimate sovereign who ruled with intelligence, justice, and force. Modern scholars re-evaluated her as a head of state, a commander, and a negotiator, moving beyond the trope of the bloodthirsty barbarian. Today, she inhabits diverse cultural spaces: documentaries, video games, academic studies on leadership and gender, and historical fiction. In some instances, she is a playable leader in strategy games. In others, she is analyzed as a model of matriarchal authority and strategic acumen. Interestingly, no one knows what Tamaris looked like. There are no coins bearing her likeness, no carved busts, no pictorial depictions from her time. Yet what she represented is clear: autonomy, resilience, power, and unyielding justice. In a world where queens were often remembered for obedience, Tamaris' memory persists because she refused to conform. Her defiance was inseparable from her culture. The Massagetæ were a nomadic warrior society, inhabiting the vast, untamed steppes east of the Caspian Sea. Unlike the urbanized and bureaucratic Persian Empire, their civilization revolved around movement, survival, and skill. Horses were both transportation and currency. Children learned to ride almost before they could walk. Archery was not sport, it was necessity. Leather armor and layered scale allowed flexibility and protection from mounted combat. Men and women alike trained as warriors. Women fought alongside men routinely. Their contributions were essential and expected. Tamaris' rise to leadership was not an aberration. It was entirely consistent with her people's values. She was extraordinary only in the scale of her deeds, not in the nature of her authority. The Massagetæ emphasized collective governance and merit-based respect. Leadership was earned through action, courage, and strategic insight. It was not a matter of hereditary entitlement, but of demonstrated ability. Laws were enforced with fairness, and property was often communal, with loyalty to the tribe valued above all. Religious practices, centered on sun worship and reverence for natural cycles, reinforced cohesion and communal responsibility. When Tamaris challenged Cyrus, she did so as both mother and queen. Her strategy combined personal motivation with military acumen. She anticipated deception, set traps, and mobilized her warriors with precision. In the pivotal battle, she led from the front, exemplifying the warrior queen archetype, commanding, inspiring, and striking fear into the enemy. Her tactics exploited the Persian reliance on rigid formations and overconfidence. She used mobility, local knowledge, and cunning to overwhelm Cyrus' forces. Victory was total. Cyrus himself was killed, and his death was marked with symbolic vengeance, the severing of his head and its ceremonial display. Whether the precise details are accurate or embellished, the underlying truths remain. Tamaris defeated a formidable empire, avenged her son, and demonstrated that leadership and strategic brilliance transcend conventional hierarchies. Her story exemplifies the interplay between personal grief and public duty. Her son's death fueled both sorrow and tactical ruthlessness, illustrating how personal stakes can shape historical outcomes. Even after victory, Tamaris exhibited pragmatic restraint. She returned her people to their normal lives, avoiding imperial ambitions or excessive taxation. Her focus was the preservation of autonomy, not expansion. In doing so, she demonstrated a rare blend of vengeance and prudence. The tale's longevity owes as much to narrative appeal as historical significance. Herodotus captured it because it satisfied the ancient appetite for drama, personal tragedy, divine witness, heroic struggle, and decisive action. Over centuries, her legend evolved, yet the central elements remained. A queen who defied a superpower, exercised strategic intelligence, and enacted justice personally and politically. She became a symbol of maternal courage, female authority, and resistance to domination. Artists, writers, and historians have all interpreted her story to reflect the values and anxieties of their own times, demonstrating the flexibility and enduring relevance of her legacy. Tamaris' cultural and historical resonance also highlights the disparities between written history and lived experience. Her people left minimal records, yet she is immortalized through external accounts, interpretation, and imagination. Her legend underscores the ways in which history often preserves the extraordinary while everyday life, especially that of nomadic cultures, remains largely invisible. The enduring fascination with her character testifies to the universal appeal of courage, justice, and resistance against overwhelming odds. Her story is, ultimately, about human determination, the capacity for leadership, and the unbreakable bond between parent and child. It reminds us that power is not confined to palaces, bureaucracies, or dynastic succession. It resides in courage, vision, and the ability to inspire loyalty. In Tamaris, we see a figure who is at once historical, mythical, and profoundly human, a warrior, a queen, a mother, and a legend. She represents the triumph of autonomy over domination, strategy over brute force, and justice over oppression. Tamaris, queen of the Massagetes, never sought fame or recognition in the annals of history. She did not patiently wait for her story to be immortalized in tapestries or etched on as stone monuments. She did not ask to be part of history's curated gallery of rulers. Instead, she tore open the door and positioned herself at the center of one of the most violent and unforgettable portraits the ancient world would ever witness. Her canvas was the open steppe, her brush the sword, and her colors the blood, sweat, and defiance of a woman who refused to bow to any power, even one as formidable as the Persian Empire. Tamaris was not the first woman to command warriors into battle, nor would she be the last. But history has a stubborn habit of treating such women as anomalies, isolated sparks of brilliance or flashes of defiance in a world otherwise dominated by men. The reality, however, is far richer. Tamaris was part of a long, often overlooked lineage of women whose leadership was inseparable from the battlefield, whose authority was measured in courage and strategy rather than courtly titles or ceremonial roles. If we rewind the clock, we see a continuum of female martial power long before Tamiris. Shemuramat, the Assyrian queen of the 9th century BCE, is a prime example. Some historians believe she may have inspired the legendary Semiramis, remembered in later myth as the slayer of rebels and builder of magnificent cities. Shemuramat ruled with authority, balancing the twin burdens of governance and military command, and she laid a precedent for women whose political and martial abilities were inseparable. Around the same period, the Scythians, cultural cousins of the Massagetæ, also demonstrated a tradition of female warriors. Archaeological excavations have revealed graves of women buried with weapons, their bones showing scars and injuries consistent with active combat. These were not ceremonial burials. These women fought, bled, and died on horseback alongside men, a reality that modern historians often overlook. Their society, like Tamiris, recognized the necessity of female participation in warfare. It was not exceptional, it was expected. After Tamiris, the pattern continued. Consider Boudica, queen of the Iceni in the 1st century CE. Her story bears striking parallels to that of Tamiris. Boudica's rebellion against the Roman Empire was sparked by personal tragedy. Her daughters were assaulted, her land seized, and her authority undermined. Her response was both brutal and calculated. She led her warriors to burn Roman settlements to the ground, demonstrating the intersection of personal grief and political strategy that had defined the legacy of warrior queens long before her. Similarly, Zenobia, queen of Palmyra in the 3rd century CE, defied the Roman Empire, carved out her own Eastern mini-empire, and even minted coins bearing her own visage. She declared independence with audacity, forcing the emperor himself to acknowledge her authority. What unites Tamiris, Boudica, Zenobia, and their predecessors is not simply power but courage. Each of these women thrived in a world that was ostensibly male, asserting authority not as caretakers or placeholders, but as strategists, generals, and sovereigns in their own right. While male leaders were celebrated for conquest, these women were often labeled unnatural, dangerous, or savage, simply because they succeeded. Tamiris was no anomaly. She was part of a global, centuries-long continuum of women who rose in moments of crisis, shaping history with both sword and mind. Yet, despite the universality of such female leadership, the historical record is sparse. Much of what we know about Tamiris comes from Herodotus, a Greek historian who was as much a storyteller as a chronicler. His account, written decades after the events he describes, is filtered through layers of hearsay, myth, and narrative embellishment. He may have never seen a Massagetæ in his life, and yet he devoted space in his histories to a queen who defied one of the greatest kings of the world. He preserved her story in all its drama because it mattered. Even in a world dominated by male generals and emperors, Tamiris' actions were too extraordinary to ignore. Over centuries, her narrative evolved. Medieval chroniclers recast her as a fierce, almost mythic Amazon. Renaissance artists depicted her as an almost caricatured figure of blood and vengeance, clutching Cyrus' severed head as if it were a ceremonial prize. Her image has always been exaggerated, romanticized, and interpreted to fit the values and anxieties of those telling her story. But beneath all these layers, the essence of Tamiris remains tangible: a queen, a mother, a strategist, and a warrior. Her cultural context is critical to understanding why she was so effective. The Massagetæ were nomadic, moving across the vast Eurasian steppe, lands too expansive and too wild for Persian satraps to control. They were not settled in cities, did not erect monumental architecture, and had no permanent institutions like the bureaucracies of Mesopotamia or Persia. Their homes were yurts, tents, or mobile wagons, structures designed for rapid assembly and disassembly, reflecting a society that prized flexibility, mobility, and survival. Cattle, sheep, goats, and most importantly, horses were the foundation of their wealth. Horses were tools, companions, and instruments of war. To ride well was survival. To ride exceptionally was to command respect and authority. This was the environment in which Tamaris was raised, a culture where leadership was earned through skill and action, not inheritance or ceremony. Women were fully integrated into this martial society. They rode, fought, hunted, and defended the tribe. Leadership was fluid and merit-based, and Tamaris rose to power because she embodied the qualities her people valued: courage, intelligence, strategic thinking, and the capacity to inspire loyalty. Tamaris' confrontation with Cyrus was not just a personal or political decision. It was a fundamental defense of her society's independence. When the Persian king, confident in his vast armies and experience as a conqueror, approached her with the proposition of marriage, he expected compliance. A political marriage would have been simple for Cyrus: a nominal queen, the incorporation of her lands, the pacification of her people. Tamaris, however, understood that to marry him would be to surrender autonomy. Her kingdom would have become another province of the Persian Empire, and she herself a pawn in a far larger game. She rejected the offer outright, an act of defiance that would spark a war, the consequences of which would reverberate across empires. Cyrus, unaccustomed to refusal, did not take this denial lightly. He crossed the Araxes River with the precision of a general accustomed to obedience, expecting that force would secure what diplomacy could not. Yet Tamaris was ready. She gathered her warriors, held council with her chiefs, and prepared for the inevitable clash with foresight and courage. The battle unfolded with strategic brilliance. Cyrus attempted to exploit the weaknesses of the Massagetæ with deception, leaving behind a lavishly provisioned camp to lure Tamaris' forces. Her son, Sparapises, took the bait, only to encounter betrayal and death in captivity. The loss of her son transformed personal grief into a driving force for vengeance. Tamaris' leadership during the subsequent battle demonstrated her capacity for both strategic and emotional intelligence. She mobilized her people, not through fear or coercion, but through shared purpose and loyalty. The clash itself, as Herodotus records, was ferocious and decisive. Tamaris fought alongside her warriors, leading from the front. Her knowledge of the terrain, her tactical acumen, and her understanding of the Persian psyche turned what might have been an overwhelming disadvantage into a decisive triumph. Cyrus fell in battle, his death symbolized by the ceremonial presentation of his head in a wineskin, a macabre yet poignant declaration of justice and retribution. Tamaris' victory had implications far beyond the battlefield. The Massagetæ preserved their autonomy and their cultural identity. Tamaris did not seek to expand her empire. She sought to protect her people and avenge her son. Her actions demonstrated that power need not be inherited or conferred. It could be earned through courage, strategy, and moral resolve. Her story was preserved, first through Herodotus, then through centuries of reinterpretation, becoming a symbol of female agency, maternal justice, and the capacity for leadership in extreme circumstances. Over time, she was mythologized, reimagined, and appropriated across cultures. In Renaissance Europe, she became a noble savage, a cautionary figure. In modern Central Asia, she is a folk hero, invoked in classrooms, political speeches, and statues as a symbol of resistance, independence, and national pride. In the Soviet era, she was reclaimed as an emblem of defiance against imperial forces. Her presence endures in documentaries, video games, historical analysis, and literature, serving as a reminder that authority and heroism do not require formal palaces, crowns, or dynasties. Tamaris' enduring influence also challenges assumptions about the recording of history. The Massagetæ themselves left almost no written record. Their achievements, values, and stories survive through the observations of outsiders, filtered through myth, exaggeration, and cultural interpretation. And yet, the human truth of Tamaris' story remains: a mother avenged, a people defended, a leader unbowed. Her actions affirm that historical impact is not always measured by monuments or inscriptions. Sometimes, it is measured by the legacy of courage, audacity, and moral clarity that transcends centuries. Her story is a testament to the resilience of human agency, the capacity for justice, and the enduring power of narrative to immortalize those who might otherwise be forgotten. Tamara's tale also serves as a bridge across centuries, linking her to other female warriors and rulers who defied patriarchal expectations. From Shimuramat to Boudica, from Zenobia to countless unnamed women of the steppe and plains, her story forms part of a continuum of female leadership that has often been minimized or erased. These women shared common traits: strategic brilliance, courage, audacity, and the capacity to lead through crisis. They were not exceptions. They were manifestations of a broader reality in which women wielded power in ways both direct and profound. Tamara's legacy illuminates this hidden history, demonstrating that leadership, courage, and agency have always transcended gender, even when historical records obscure that truth. Even in death, her story challenges conventional memory. No palaces, no tombs, no inscriptions survive to mark her existence. Yet her impact continues to ripple across time and culture. She persists as a symbol, not merely of conquest or vengeance, but of human resilience, of the refusal to submit, and of the capacity of a single individual to alter the course of empires. The steppe itself seems to echo her presence, a silent testament to a woman who refused to be constrained by expectation, circumstance, or the most powerful empire of her age. Tamara's story reminds us that history is not only about kings and empires. It is also about mothers and queens, warriors and strategists, grief and vengeance, survival and autonomy. It is about the silent moments after battle when a leader stands alone in a field of bodies, knowing that the course of the world has been changed by her hand, even if the world refuses to acknowledge it. In essence, Tamara's legend is a study in contradiction and power. She was simultaneously a mother and a queen, a warrior and a strategist, an avenger and a protector. Her story transcends the limitations of the sources that preserve it, offering a model of female leadership, courage, and autonomy that resonates across millennia. In every age that has rediscovered her, she has been a figure of inspiration, a symbol of resistance, and a reminder that heroism and authority can exist outside the conventional boundaries imposed by society. She endures because she refused to be invisible. She remains a caution, a legend, and a beacon. Her legacy is the refusal to be forgotten, a name that rides on the wind across the steppe, echoing a simple yet profound truth. Power, courage, and justice are not confined to palaces, crowns, or men. They belong to those willing to seize them, with sword in hand and fire in the heart. Nomadic societies, often dismissed by settled civilizations as chaotic or primitive, were in fact highly sophisticated systems of social organization, governance, and culture. Life on the move required ingenuity, adaptability, and a deep understanding of human relationships, nature, and survival. Power in these societies rarely flowed in a simple, linear hereditary fashion. Instead, it was negotiated through clans, tribes, and familial alliances, often based on merit, influence, and personal charisma. Leadership was earned, not merely inherited. A Khan, chieftain, or tribal leader might rise to prominence because of battlefield prowess, tactical ingenuity, oratory skills, or the magnetic force of their personality. Loyalty was not abstract. It was earned in council circles around flickering campfires, tested in raids, and validated across windswept battlefields. A leader's word carried weight because it had been earned, not decreed, and betrayal could be met with swift and personal consequences. Nomads were far from being isolated observers of history. They were, in many ways, its connective tissue. They moved goods, people, and ideas across vast distances, long before empires established bureaucracies or postal systems. Silk traveled from the markets of China to the Mediterranean via nomadic intermediaries. Spices crossed deserts and mountains from India. Silver and metalwork moved from Persia, and slaves, tragically, traveled from Europe to distant lands. These mobile traders and raiders were the original transcontinental couriers, the vectors of cultural exchange, before imperial administrators codified trade routes. When trade faltered or political alliances failed, these same nomads could pivot into predatory efficiency. Raiding was not random. It was strategic, swift, and terrifyingly precise, a natural extension of their mobility and intimate knowledge of the land. The legacy of nomadic peoples is not carved in stone, but sung in memory. Oral tradition formed the backbone of law, governance, and historical record. In a single storyteller's voice, a tribe's entire legal code, historical events, and moral instruction could be preserved. These were not mere tales for entertainment. They were repositories of identity, instruction, and governance. Elders and bards were revered for their memory and wisdom. The survival of a tribe depended on the accuracy and continuity of their storytelling. To the empires they bordered, nomads were unpredictable, alien, and dangerous. To themselves, they were masters of adaptation, guardians of freedom, and heirs to the wind, their identity inseparable from the vast landscapes they traversed. They left few permanent structures behind, but every time they rode across the steppe or the desert, they reshaped the world. Long before the Mongols thundered across Eurasia, the Scythians, sometimes called Scythians by the Greeks, ruled the windswept steppe. From roughly the 9th to the 2nd century BCE, these horsebound warriors controlled vast stretches of territory, from the Black Sea in the west to the edges of Central Asia in the east. To Greek writers, they were fearsome and exotic barbarians, their nomadic lifestyle incomprehensible and often terrifying. To themselves, they were a people defined by freedom, vengeance, and pride. Science society was meticulously organized around mobility and martial skill. From infancy, boys were trained in horsemanship, learning to balance and ride before they could walk steadily. Archery was not a recreational pursuit but a necessity. Young warriors practiced shooting short composite bows while galloping at full speed, preparing for both hunting and combat. Their arsenal was efficient and deadly. Curved swords, battle axes, iron-tipped spears, and specialized bows all suited to a mounted, agile fighting style. The Scythian warrior was not exclusively male. Archaeological evidence confirms what Herodotus, the Greek historian, hinted at. Women fought as well. Graves of female warriors reveal skeletons with battle injuries consistent with actual combat, buried with weapons and sometimes gold ornaments. These women were not ceremonial figures. They were active participants in warfare, as integral to their society's defense as men. Though the Scythian people did not construct cities or fortifications, their cairns or burial mounds endure as a testament to their culture. Within these mounds, archaeologists have unearthed intricate artifacts, golden ornaments, preserved textiles with embroidered motifs, and tools or weapons that signify both status and skill. The Scythian artistic style, characterized by swirling depictions of animals and predatory motifs, reflects a worldview closely entwined with nature, movement, and the hunt. Despite their reputation as fierce raiders, the Scythians were sophisticated in diplomacy and commerce. They traded extensively with Greek colonies along the Black Sea, offering furs, grain, and slaves in exchange for wine, pottery, and luxury goods. Herodotus recounts their customs with a mixture of horror and admiration. Tales of blood drinking or scalps displayed at feasts are juxtaposed with praise for their loyalty, fairness in judgment, and the strong bonds of kinship. Their religion was animistic and deeply tied to natural cycles. They revered gods of war, fertility, and the elemental forces, often using ritualistic practices that included horse sacrifices or the ceremonial inhalation of cannabis smoke. Their worldview was cyclical and relational, grounded in movement and the rhythms of the land rather than ownership or settlement. Eventually, the pressure of neighboring nomadic groups, such as the Sarmatians, along with encroaching empires, led to the decline of the Scythians. Yet their legacy endured, establishing the archetype of the mobile, deadly steppe warrior, independent, unbound, and perpetually dangerous to any settled power. When the silhouette of a mounted archer appears against the horizon of the steppe, it is the echo of the Scions, a storm that preceded empire. While the Scions ruled the grasslands, the Bedouins carved their legacy in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. Unlike the thunderous charge of the steppe nomads, Bedouin life unfolded in harmony with the desert's rhythms. They were not mere wanderers. They were engineers of survival, having mastered one of the most inhospitable regions on Earth. Daily life was synchronized with droughts and rainfall, grazing patterns, and the celestial movements that guided navigation across vast stretches of sand. Their dwellings, black goat hair tents known as beedulsh, were practical and sophisticated, lightweight, breathable, and portable, designed to accommodate movement with herds and the demands of a harsh environment. Camels, revered as the ships of the desert, provided transportation, sustenance, clothing, and economic currency, making them indispensable to the Bedouin way of life. The social structure of Bedouin society revolved around kinship and clan loyalty. Honor, or sharif, was not a mere abstract value. It was the very fabric of social cohesion. Disputes over honor could escalate into feuds lasting generations, and insults were never trivial. Yet generosity and hospitality, known as karam, were equally sacred. A stranger could expect food, water, and protection for 3 days without question, a commitment that symbolized the tribe's integrity and social trust. Bedouin warfare was tactical, centered on raids, or gazu. These were not indiscriminate massacres, but strategic incursions aimed at acquiring livestock, goods, or prestige. Success elevated a man's status, while failure could stain a family or tribe for decades. Bedouin life, however, was not defined solely by conflict. Poetry, oral tradition, and song preserved history, reinforced social norms, and celebrated individual heroism. Bards acted as living archives, passing stories from one generation to the next, turning memory into law and history into performance. Trade caravans traversed Bedouin territories, and these tribesmen became indispensable guides, protectors, and sometimes covert intermediaries, facilitating the flow of incense, spices, and silk from southern Arabia to the Levant and beyond. No discussion of nomadic impact on history would be complete without the Mongols. In the 13th century, the Mongols rose from the plains of Mongolia to establish the largest contiguous land empire in history. Like their predecessors, the Scions and Massagetes, the Mongols were mobile, clan-based, and fiercely adaptive. Life on the steppe was brutal. Nomadic families lived in jairs, circular felt tents designed for rapid assembly and portability. Herds of horses, yaks, and goats sustained them. Children were taught to ride before they could read, and horsemanship was considered a skill essential to survival. Knowledge was transmitted orally. Songs, proverbs, and practical instructions replaced written records. Education was functional and immediate. A child who could ride, shoot, and survive in harsh conditions was already literate in the steppe's most important code, survival. Mongol society, like other nomadic groups, was clan-based but meritocratic. Leaders emerged through charisma, strategic ability, and martial skill. A chieftain's authority depended not solely on birth but on the ability to inspire loyalty, demonstrate tactical brilliance, and maintain order. Every family and clan member had a role in the cohesion of the tribe, from managing herds to participating in raids. Warfare emphasized mobility and intelligence. Cavalry tactics, coordinated archery, and surprise maneuvers ensured that even vastly outnumbered forces could achieve tactical superiority. The Mongols' ability to coordinate across immense distances, to move with speed, and to adapt to diverse terrains made them almost invincible against slower, bureaucratic armies. In essence, the Mongols, like the Scions, the Massagetes, and the Bedouins, exemplified the sophisticated complexity of nomadic life. Their societies thrived not despite mobility, but because of it. Survival, leadership, trade, warfare, and culture were all interwoven with the land, animals, and seasons. To outsiders, nomads may have seemed chaotic or lawless, but in reality, they possessed highly structured social systems, a deep sense of ethics and honor, and cultural practices that reinforced identity, cohesion, and intergenerational knowledge. They reshaped civilizations, altered trade routes, and determined the outcomes of battles and empires, all without the permanence of cities, stone walls, or monumental inscriptions. They were, in every sense, the agents of their own destiny, heirs to wind, sand, and steppe. Through the science, the Bedouins, the Massagete, and the Mongols, we see a pattern emerge. Nomads were adaptive, resilient, and innovative. They were masters of mobility, pragmatism, and strategic warfare. They excelled in social cohesion, oral preservation of knowledge, and sophisticated trade networks. They were fierce defenders of freedom, yet capable of diplomacy and commerce. Their influence stretched far beyond the lands they roamed, leaving imprints on the cultures, economies, and histories of sedentary civilizations. Their legacies are preserved less in monuments than in enduring archetypes. The mounted archer silhouetted against the steppe horizon, the caravan crossing the desert with stars as guides, the warrior queen defying empires, the strategist who moves with wind and sun as allies. Each represents the remarkable ingenuity, courage, and adaptability of nomadic peoples, whose lives were inseparable from the landscapes they mastered. Nomads did not simply survive, they transformed the world. They were not defined by permanence or cities, but by freedom, mobility, and mastery of environments others deemed inhospitable. From the Sayans of the steppe to the Bedouins of the desert, from the Massagete to the Mongols, nomadic peoples shaped history on their own terms. Their influence was profound. They connected empires, protected trade routes, enforced cultural exchange, and served as both catalysts and disruptors in the geopolitical landscape of their times. They were as essential to the shaping of Eurasian history as any city, army, or empire, leaving legacies encoded not in stone, but in movement, memory, and legend. What set the Mongols apart from virtually every other society in history was the way they weaponized mobility. While many civilizations relied on walls, forts, or sheer manpower to exert control, the Mongols turned movement itself into a form of power. Under Genghis Khan, the fractious tribes of the Mongolian steppe were reorganized into a centralized, merit-based system that shattered old loyalties. No longer was a warrior's primary allegiance owed solely to his bloodline or clan. Instead, loyalty was redirected toward the Khan, a figure whose authority was as personal as it was strategic. And with this transformation, the Mongols fundamentally altered the landscape of warfare, governance, and global interaction. Mongol military campaigns were masterpieces of tactical genius, blending speed, deception, and psychological insight. Their mounted archers could fire accurately while racing at full gallop, employing feigned retreats to lure opponents into ambushes. A single Mongol unit could traverse more than 100 miles in a day, outpacing any conventional army. But their genius was not limited to brute force or mobility alone. Scouts and spies were deployed ahead of campaigns to gather intelligence. Signal flags communicated movements across vast distances, and psychological operations, spreading rumors, terrifying enemies with sudden night attacks, or demonstrating ruthless efficiency, often turned battles before swords were drawn. By the time the Mongols encountered a fortified city, they had already mapped its weaknesses and devised a strategy that often combined direct assault with cunning deception. Chinese and Persian engineers, co-opted into the Mongol armies, introduced siege techniques such as catapults, battering rams, and flaming projectiles, turning the Mongol horsemen into both a mobile cavalry and a devastating siege force. Yet, to frame the Mongols solely as destroyers would be to overlook another dimension of their empire. As they conquered territories stretching from China to the edges of Europe, the Mongols simultaneously became agents of connectivity. They revived and protected the Silk Road, ensuring safe passage for merchants, pilgrims, and travelers. Goods moved faster, and ideas, religions, and technologies flowed across continents. Even diseases, such as the Black Death, followed the same network, illustrating the power of their logistical reach. The Mongols instituted systems resembling early passports, protected religious minorities, and allowed Jews, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and others to practice their faiths openly, so long as they remained loyal to the Khan. The empire became a conduit for exchange, a living network that transformed Eurasia long before globalization became a concept. Despite their empire building, the Mongols never truly abandoned their nomadic roots. Even as they commanded sprawling territories and collected tribute from cities, the Khan and his generals returned to the steppe, to their jairs, and to the rhythms of pastoral life. Conquest did not equal settlement. No matter how high they climbed, Mongol rulers remained nomads at heart, moving with the seasons, herds, and stars. To sedentary empires, nomads were a complicated presence, at once potential allies, necessary trade partners, and existential threats. To the nomads themselves, the distinction between trade and raid was fluid, negotiable depending on circumstances, wealth, and respect. One day, a nomadic tribe might safely escort a caravan across the desert. The next, they might plunder the same town if their honor was slighted or obligations unmet. Power was exercised through both generosity and coercion, and the horizon remained the ultimate arbiter. Trade was indispensable to nomadic life. Most steppe and desert peoples could not grow grain, forge metals efficiently, or produce textiles, so exchange was vital. They offered livestock, furs, hides, and occasionally exotic goods like falcons, horses, or other prized commodities. In return, they acquired tools, pottery, spices, and luxury items otherwise unavailable. Some traded directly with empires, while others functioned as intermediaries between regions. Even trade caravans were militarized, armed to defend themselves or ready to strike if negotiations failed. A single tribal chief could negotiate respectfully with a governor in the morning and raid the governor's warehouses in the afternoon. Empires saw betrayal, nomads saw flexibility. This duality defined their interaction with neighboring civilizations, producing complex border economies, hybrid towns, and frontier settlements that were part market, part military outpost. Governors bribed chieftains to ensure peace. Merchants traded intelligence and horses. Marriages sometimes sealed alliances. Nomads exercised power without fixed structures, using mobility itself as leverage. The Scian nomads, for instance, traded grain, gold, and furs with Greek colonies along the Black Sea. Yet when cities cheated or slighted them, retaliation was swift and merciless. The Bedouins protected caravan routes for spices and incense. Yet when payment was withheld, the same camels that carried goods redirected their loads elsewhere. The Mongols' approach to commerce was similar. Under Genghis Khan, initial attempts at peaceful trade with the Khwarezmian Empire were met with execution of Mongol merchants. The response was swift annihilation of entire cities, demonstrating that, in nomadic eyes, commerce was inseparable from honor and political respect. To engage in trade with nomads was to recognize their sovereignty, even if they lacked walls or cities. Disrespect carried consequences. These dynamics created a symbiotic but volatile frontier system. Towns on the edges of nomadic territories were hybrid zones, where commerce and conflict intertwined. Local governors might pay off tribal leaders, exchange intelligence, or facilitate marriages to secure temporary peace. Caravans traversing these zones required armed escorts that could act as both protection and enforcement. Life on the frontier demanded flexibility. Negotiation and violence were two sides of the same coin. The nomadic method of influence, power projected without permanent occupation, allowed them to shape empires, control trade, and assert sovereignty over vast regions without ever committing to sedentary life. In a world without libraries, printing presses, or permanent archives, oral tradition became the lifeblood of cultural memory. Nomads preserved their history, law, and identity in the spoken word. Elders and bards were revered as living repositories of knowledge, carrying generations of genealogies, battle strategies, and ethical codes. For the peasants, poetry was not mere entertainment. It was a binding force for law, honor, and memory. A single verse could shame an enemy, immortalize a hero, or instruct future generations on morality and strategy. Oral history was practical, adaptive, and resilient. Stories evolved as they were told, but the core lessons of loyalty, courage, cunning, and honor persisted. The Mongols also cultivated oral preservation. The secret history of the Mongols, although eventually committed to writing, was initially memorized and recited to educate and unify the tribes. It conveyed the life and achievements of Genghis Khan, but also the values essential to Mongol identity: loyalty, family, revenge, and ambition. Battles, treaties, and moral teachings were intertwined in narratives that were as much cultural instruction as historical record. Similarly, the Scythians, predecessors on the steppe, left almost no written archives, yet Greek sources such as Herodotus preserved traces of their oral traditions. History, for nomads, existed in voices and memory as much as in stone or parchment. Oral tradition was living, flexible, and profoundly human. It allowed nomadic societies to survive, adapt, and maintain identity across centuries and migrations, long after empires and their bureaucracies crumbled. One remarkable aspect of these societies was the role of women. In many ancient sedentary civilizations, women were confined behind palace walls, secluded, and largely absent from public life. Nomadic societies, by contrast, often placed women in far more visible and active roles. Archaeological evidence confirms that female warriors participated in battles, not as ceremonial figures, but as full members of the fighting force. Graves of women buried with weapons, showing combat injuries, demonstrate their integration into martial culture. Leadership, too, was not strictly male. Tribes sometimes recognized exceptional women as advisors, commanders, or even tribal heads, illustrating the comparatively egalitarian flexibility of nomadic social systems. Survival demanded competency, courage, and intelligence from every member of the group, not merely those of a particular gender. Mobility, commerce, warfare, and oral tradition formed the core of nomadic resilience. They leveraged speed to project power, enforced their authority through tactical brilliance, and preserved their identity through memory. Every raid, caravan escort, and negotiation was both practical and symbolic, reinforcing social cohesion, honor, and respect. Nomads did not need cities, walls, or written archives to endure. They depended on adaptability, memory, and the constant presence of the horizon. Where sedentary empires built monuments to permanence, nomads built networks of influence and legacy in movement itself. They reshaped entire regions, economically, culturally, and militarily, while leaving few tangible traces behind. The Mongols, following centuries of steppe precedent, exemplified this philosophy at its most extreme. They conquered cities, yet always returned to the steppe. They imposed order and law, yet retained the freedom of mobility at the core of their identity. They harnessed violence and commerce, simultaneously feared and respected. Oral tradition preserved not only the exploits of their leaders, but also the values that sustained nomadic life across generations: courage, loyalty, adaptability, and reverence for freedom. Through their actions, the Mongols demonstrated the transformative potential of societies that do not rely on stone, bureaucracy, or rigid hierarchy, but on human ingenuity, skill, and relentless motion. In essence, the Mongols were both destroyers and connectors, warriors and merchants, rulers and nomads. Their legacy endures not solely because of their conquests, but because they reveal a fundamentally different understanding of power, identity, and survival. To the steppe peoples, the horizon was the measure of possibility, the wind a companion, and movement itself a form of sovereignty. Across deserts, grasslands, and plains, nomads wielded mobility as a weapon, memory as a library, and adaptability as their shield. They remind us that history is not only built in cities and empires, but also on the backs of horses, in the cadence of poetry, and in the memory of those who ride with the wind. In nomadic societies, life operated under a logic fundamentally different from that of sedentary empires. Unlike cities where social hierarchies were rigid, where men monopolized power, and where women were often confined to private spaces, nomadic life demanded that every member of the community contribute to survival, governance, and defense. There was no idle luxury, no room for negligence. Necessity dictated opportunity, and in these societies, opportunity translated into real authority for women. From the Sayans of the Eurasian steppe to the Mongols of Mongolia, historical and archaeological evidence paints a picture of women who were far more than caretakers or household managers. They were riders, warriors, shamans, diplomats, and tribal leaders, fully integrated into the structures that determined life on the move. Consider the science. Across the vast expanses of the steppe, graves have been uncovered showing women interred with swords, armor, bows, and arrows. Their skeletal remains bear the unmistakable marks of combat injuries, wounds that could only have been acquired in battle, not ceremonial display. These women were active participants in the martial culture of their people. Greek historians, confronted with the idea of women fighting alongside men, were simultaneously fascinated and terrified. The myths of the Amazons, legendary warrior women, were undoubtedly inspired by encounters with these steppe tribes. Stories of female fighters clad in leather, shooting arrows from horseback, or leading raids, were exaggerated, romanticized, and mythologized, yet they contain kernels of truth rooted in the lived experiences of nomadic women. The Mongols extended this pattern into empire. Life on the move demanded that women manage the encampments while men went on campaigns. But even at the highest levels of power, women exercised real influence. Genghis Khan's daughters and daughters-in-law did not merely occupy ceremonial positions. They governed territories, led armies, negotiated treaties, and engaged in diplomacy. Among the most remarkable was Sagakani Beki, a strategist whose counsel shaped the course of Mongol politics. She orchestrated alliances, raised emperors, and ensured that her political vision endured beyond her own lifespan. Her life exemplifies the degree of agency women could attain in a system that valued skill, intelligence, and loyalty over gender alone. Bedouin societies were different, but equally instructive. While Bedouin women had fewer overt leadership roles in combat or governance, they wielded influence through social and cultural channels. A woman's tent was her kingdom. Within it, she managed resources, mediated disputes, raised children, and maintained the honor of her family. Some tribes allowed women to initiate divorce, control property, or own camels, the ultimate symbol of wealth, status, and survival. Through poetry, storytelling, and social negotiation, women shaped cultural memory and maintained continuity across generations. Hospitality, a core Bedouin value, was often enacted and preserved by women. It was both a practical necessity and a sacred ritual. Guests received protection, sustenance, and respect, not merely as courtesy, but as a religious and ethical obligation. Women were central to this moral economy, acting as the guardians of honor, tradition, and social cohesion. Religion amplified the authority of women in many nomadic societies. Across the Turkic and Siberian steppe, female shamans held extraordinary spiritual power. They were healers, mediators, and advisors, tasked with maintaining a connection to ancestral spirits, the forces of nature, and the unseen world. They were not outliers or peripheral mystics. They were central pillars of society, their wisdom and guidance integral to governance, conflict resolution, and ritual practice. Among the Sayans, for instance, ritual practice revolved around a pantheon of gods connected to the natural world. Titi, perhaps equivalent to the Greek Hestia, presided over hearth and home, while Papios, the sky god, oversaw justice and fate. Rituals were visceral and direct, often involving horse sacrifices, smoke from sacred herbs, and oaths sworn under the open sky. Religion was not mediated by a priestly class. It was embodied in the lived experiences of warriors, women, and shamans alike. The Bedouins, before the rise of Islam, practiced forms of polytheism and animism. Their belief system emphasized the unseen, spirits inhabiting rocks, winds, and solitary landscapes. Poets and seers often claimed to be channels for these spirits, their words inspired or possessed, shaping tribal decisions, laws, and culture. In this world, spiritual authority did not necessarily correlate with gender or lineage. It correlated with insight, courage, and the ability to act in harmony with natural and supernatural forces. Women, as managers of households, keepers of sacred spaces within the tent, and transmitters of oral knowledge, wielded immense spiritual influence. Their contributions were both practical and sacred, forming the moral and ritual backbone of the tribe. Mongol spirituality offers a similarly compelling example. Their central belief system, Tangrism, revolved around the eternal blue sky, Tangri. Tangri was not a deity confined to temples, but a living presence in the sky above, observing, judging, and sustaining all life. The Khan's authority was derived directly from Tangri, a divine mandate inseparable from the natural order. Yet, alongside the worship of the sky, Mongols recognized earth spirits, ancestral ghosts, and sacred fires at the center of each yurt. Shamanism was interwoven into political and social life, with shamans serving as advisors, healers, and intermediaries with the spiritual world. The flexibility of Mongol spirituality allowed it to absorb new influences. As the Mongols conquered regions with Buddhists, Christians, and Muslims, they adopted aspects of these religions while maintaining their core nomadic beliefs. Religion, like life on the move, was adaptive, mobile, and intensely practical. Sacred practice was not tied to walls or permanence. It traveled with the people, evolving while retaining continuity. This adaptability extended beyond ritual into cultural memory. Nomadic societies had no libraries, no monumental archives, and often no written records. History, law, and genealogy were preserved through memory. Oral tradition was sacred. Elders and bards were living libraries. They memorized lineages stretching back generations, chronicled battles and treaties, and transmitted cultural norms through song and story. Bedouin poetry was not entertainment. It was law, history, and social instruction. A verse could honor heroes, shame enemies, or mediate disputes. Its recitation was precise and memorized, maintaining continuity across generations. Mongols maintained similar practices. The secret history of the Mongols, while eventually written down, originated as an oral narrative. It conveyed both events and the values of Mongol society: loyalty, revenge, courage, and the obligations owed to family and tribe. Oral culture ensured continuity and adaptability, preserving knowledge even when empires fell, texts decayed, or cities were destroyed. Memory became the archive, and the tongue, the library. Mobility and oral tradition intersected in ways that shaped the very concept of nomadic power. Unlike sedentary empires that relied on walls and monuments for defense and legitimacy, nomadic societies projected influence through movement, adaptability, and the mastery of environment. Raiders and traders alike wielded speed as a weapon, using mobility to manipulate, negotiate, and intimidate. They reshaped geopolitical realities without the need to occupy or build permanent structures. They were architects of influence who operated beyond conventional maps, challenging the very assumptions of sedentary rulers. This combination of mobility, martial skill, and cultural memory created societies that were simultaneously resilient, formidable, and flexible. Nomads could vanish across the horizon, emerge unexpectedly, and rewrite the rules of engagement for anyone who underestimated them. Women were central to this system, and their authority was not ceremonial. In warfare, they fought and led. In governance, they advised and ruled. In spiritual practice, they mediated between the living and unseen. In household and tribal life, they managed resources, ensured continuity, and maintained honor. In the absence of rigid hierarchies and urban infrastructure, necessity dictated that women occupy roles that would have been denied to them in sedentary empires. A woman might be the strategist who directs a battle, the diplomat who negotiates a fragile peace, or the poet who preserves history in verse. In nomadic societies, these were not exceptions. They were part of the fabric of survival and governance. Religious belief reinforced this integration. From Sayans and Bedouins to Mongols, nomadic cosmologies emphasized the sacred in motion. Gods were not confined to temples. Spirits were encountered in wind, river, fire, and sky. Rituals were enacted on the move, integrated into daily life, and intertwined with survival. Women, as managers of domestic and ritual spaces, were central to maintaining balance between the natural and supernatural realms. Their spiritual authority, combined with martial and economic power, made them indispensable to the community. Trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange were also arenas where nomadic women exercised influence. While men often led raiding parties or managed large-scale military campaigns, women engaged with merchants, coordinated supplies, and preserved the continuity of trade networks. Nomads facilitated long-distance exchange across Eurasia, Arabia, and beyond. The Silk Road, often imagined as a static trade route between cities, was animated and maintained by the mobility, knowledge, and authority of nomadic peoples. Tribes acted as guides, protectors, and intermediaries, ensuring safe passage and negotiating terms. Women, as managers of households, tents, and logistics, played vital roles in these exchanges. Their influence ensured the survival of cultural knowledge, economic systems, and social networks that connected distant empires. This integration of mobility, martial skill, spiritual authority, and economic participation made nomadic societies extraordinarily resilient. Unlike sedentary states, which depended on fixed locations, bureaucracies, and monumental infrastructure, nomads relied on adaptability, memory, and skill. Their influence extended beyond immediate survival, reshaping empires, trade networks, and cultural landscapes. Empires feared them for good reason. They could outmaneuver armies, bypass walls, and exploit knowledge networks that sedentary rulers struggled to control. Sayans, Bedouins, Turks, and Mongols all demonstrated the same principle. Mobility, when harnessed effectively, could outthink monuments, walls, and the assumptions of sedentary power. Nomads were also cultural bridges. As they moved across continents, they carried music, recipes, storytelling traditions, and religion. Tengri worship, Bedouin law and honor codes, and Sayans animistic practices influenced surrounding societies. Mongol conquests, for example, facilitated the transfer of Chinese printing technology to Persia, spreading literacy, administrative practices, and innovation. Nomadic peoples were not mere marauders. They were vectors of cultural exchange, creating lasting impacts on language, governance, and religion. Their presence ensured that distant civilizations interacted in ways that would have been impossible without the mobility and adaptability of nomadic life. Crucially, women were central to every aspect of this influence. They fought, led, governed, negotiated, mediated, and preserved cultural memory. From the Sayans battle women, to the Mongols princesses and political strategists, to Bedouin matriarchs and shamans, women were inseparable from the mechanisms that made nomadic societies function. They were not anomalies or exceptions. They were essential. Nomadic life demanded flexibility and capability from every member. Women stepped up as needed, wielding bow, pin, or wisdom with equal authority. In doing so, they subverted the gendered limitations common in sedentary societies, embedding equality within the practical realities of mobility and survival. Spirituality, mobility, and memory were intertwined with women's roles. In nomadic cosmologies, the sacred was everywhere: sky, wind, river, mountain, and fire. Rituals and belief systems were practical, adaptive, and performative. Women maintained these practices, ensuring spiritual continuity and cultural cohesion. Shamans, often women, bridged the mortal and divine, offering counsel, healing, and ritual oversight. In Mongol, Bedouin, and steppe cultures alike, women wielded spiritual power as part of everyday governance, domestic life, and martial strategy. Ultimately, nomadic societies were models of adaptive resilience. They demonstrate how mobility, necessity, memory, and spiritual authority combine to produce complex social structures capable of influencing entire regions. Women were central to this resilience, occupying roles that combined domestic management, martial skill, spiritual authority, and cultural preservation. From the steppe to the desert, across centuries and continents, nomadic women were not spectators in history. They were its architects, warriors, advisors, and keepers of legacy. Their stories, though often transmitted orally, shaped civilizations, influenced empires, and ensured that nomadic cultures remained not footnotes, but formative forces in global history. Turkish nomads, like the earlier steppe cultures of Central Asia, left an enduring mark on the world. Their mobility, resilience, and strategic acumen laid the foundations for empires such as the Ottomans. The trails they rode, carved into the landscape by centuries of movement and trade, became the arteries of civilization. These paths were more than routes for horses and caravans. They were conduits for culture, commerce, and communication long before modern roads and railways existed. Even after their empires faded or transformed, the spirit of these nomads endured. It persisted in traditions of horsemanship, in the oral storytelling cultures that preserved memory across generations, and in the values of kinship, independence, and adaptability that continue to echo across steppes, deserts, and tundras. Their legacy also serves as a warning. No empire, however grand, is permanent. The wind, the steppe, the desert, forces that cannot be contained, can erase borders just as surely as armies can build them. Nomadic influence demonstrates that power does not need to be carved in stone, inscribed on pillars, or displayed in monumental architecture to be real. It can exist in motion, in adaptability, and in the ability to endure where empires falter. Today, some nomadic peoples remain, though their numbers are fewer, and their ways of life are increasingly constrained by modern borders, climate change, and urban expansion. Yet, their descendants continue to carry cultural traditions older than most modern nations. Hospitality, reverence for animals, oral storytelling, and deep knowledge of land and sky are still central to their identities. When one studies history, it is tempting to focus on monumental structures, the palaces, temples, and thrones of kings. But between these monuments, in the spaces of movement, survival, and oral memory, is where history was truly made, where nomads lived, and where the pulse of history moved. Fast forward to mid-19th century America. The country was a land of contrasts, divided not only by politics, but by geography. The eastern states bustled with cities, factories, and ports, while the western frontier stretched endlessly across mountains, deserts, and gold fields. Between the two lay more than 1,700 miles of rugged, often unforgiving wilderness. Traveling from New York to California was an epic undertaking. One could sail around Cape Horn, a perilous journey of weeks, or travel overland by wagon for months, enduring disease, scarcity, and the ever-present threat of bandits. Yet, a vision persisted, a railroad that could bind the country together, connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was a dream both audacious and transformative. Such a railroad would not only unite the nation geographically, but also accelerate communication, troop movements, and economic development. It would open markets and settle the frontier, consolidating America's national identity and expanding its industrial capabilities. Achieving it required immense resources, political authority, financial investment, manpower, and vast tracts of land. The Civil War, which raged across the country, paradoxically facilitated this ambition. In 1862, amid the chaos of conflict, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act. This legislation authorized two railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, to build a transcontinental line from opposite ends of the nation. The Union Pacific would advance westward from Omaha, Nebraska, while the Central Pacific would push east from Sacramento, California. They were to meet in the middle, connecting the coasts and forging the first continuous rail link across the continent. The government incentivized the project with massive land grants. For every mile of track laid, each company received up to 640 acres of public land, along with generous loans. On paper, it was a visionary enterprise. In reality, it became one of the most arduous and dangerous construction efforts in American history. Workers faced mountains, deserts, scorching heat, biting cold, disease, and relentless labor. Thousands of men, immigrants, freedmen, and laborers risked life and limb to realize a dream that would reshape the nation. The indigenous nations who had lived for generations on these lands experienced the railroad not as progress, but as an existential threat. For them, the coming tracks symbolized displacement, loss, and the invasion of their ancestral territories. Construction began simultaneously at both ends. The Central Pacific, beginning in Sacramento in 1863, faced the immediate and terrifying challenge of the Sierra Nevada mountains. These granite giants rose abruptly, treacherous in their sheer cliffs, prone to avalanches, and suffused with winter snow that sometimes reached 40 feet. At this time, dynamite had not yet been invented. Laborers relied on black powder, hand tools, and their own physical endurance. Every mile of track through the Sierras was a war against nature itself. Initially, the company hired Irish immigrants and other white laborers, but the grueling conditions caused many to abandon the work. The solution came in the form of Chinese immigrants, primarily from Guangdong province. By 1865, over 10,000 Chinese workers comprised more than 80% of the Central Pacific workforce. They were paid less than white workers, housed in rudimentary and often dangerous camps, and faced relentless racial discrimination. Yet they proved indispensable, demonstrating extraordinary skill, resilience, and endurance. The Chinese laborers performed feats of engineering and courage that are almost unimaginable. They blasted tunnels through solid rock, suspended themselves in baskets over vertical cliffs to chip away stone, and constructed wooden trestles that spanned deep ravines. Tunnel number 6, a 2-year endeavor, epitomized the dangers of the work. Snowdrifts buried workers in their vertical shafts, avalanches struck without warning, and explosions often went awry. Dozens perished, yet the line advanced, inch by perilous inch. In winter, entire labor camps were buried beneath snow, leaving men trapped in icy entrapments with little food or shelter. Despite these hazards, the Chinese crews pressed forward, their determination and ingenuity unmatched, ensuring that the Central Pacific could emerge from the mountains and continue eastward into the deserts beyond. The Union Pacific faced different but equally daunting challenges. Starting from Omaha, Nebraska, the company advanced west across the seemingly endless Great Plains. Unlike the Sierra Nevada, the terrain was relatively flat, but the obstacles were no less formidable. The plains were the ancestral lands of the Ponca, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota Sioux. These nations had lived and hunted on the plains for centuries. The railroad intruded on their sacred hunting grounds, disrupted the migration of buffalo herds, and threatened their very way of life. Resistance was swift and fierce. Raids on camps, attacks on surveyors, and destruction of temporary rail constructions were common. To protect the track, the U.S. government stationed soldiers and built forts along the route, turning the construction process into a militarized operation. Workers labored under armed guard, creating a tense environment that blended construction with low-grade warfare. The Union Pacific workforce was as diverse as the challenges they faced. Irish immigrants, many of whom had survived famine and civil war, formed the backbone of the labor force. They were experienced, adaptable, and relentless, laying miles of track at a speed that amazed contemporaries. Former Union soldiers and freed African Americans were also employed, some seeking stability in a nation still healing from the Civil War. Their contributions were vital, yet largely unrecognized. Life in the temporary towns, colloquially known as Hell on Wheels, was harsh. Gambling, drinking, violence, and disease were constant companions to the laborers, who lived in tents and rudimentary shanties, working long hours in extreme conditions. Political and financial pressures, combined with the natural challenges of the plains and mountains, made construction a grueling test of endurance, organization, and human spirit. By 1867, both companies had made significant progress. The Central Pacific emerged from the Sierra Nevada and confronted the harsh but flat expanses of the western deserts. The Union Pacific pressed steadily westward, advancing into Wyoming and preparing to navigate the Rocky Mountains. The final convergence in the Utah Desert, where the rails would meet at Promontory Summit, represented not just a geographic milestone, but a testament to human labor, endurance, and coordination. This monumental achievement was underwritten by an extraordinary multinational workforce whose names and stories are largely unrecorded. Without the Chinese laborers who braved the Sierras, the Irish and African American workers who pushed west across the plains, and the innumerable support crews, cooks, blacksmiths, and supply haulers, the Transcontinental Railroad would have been impossible. Despite their central roles, these laborers received little recognition. The Chinese workers were excluded from the iconic Golden Spike photographs and celebrations. Irish and African American contributions were similarly minimized in contemporary accounts. Yet their collective efforts created a network that transformed the United States, shrinking a continent from months of perilous travel to mere days. The railroad connected markets, facilitated migration, and catalyzed industrial expansion. It enabled movement of troops, goods, and information on a scale previously unimaginable. Its construction left indelible marks on the landscape, human society, and history itself. At every stage, the Transcontinental Railroad demonstrates the intersection of human endurance, technological innovation, and the exploitation of marginalized labor. The Chinese crews, for instance, developed methods to chip through solid granite using minimal tools, while simultaneously navigating logistical challenges, harsh weather, and social hostility. They prepared meals, maintained equipment, and sustained morale under conditions that would have broken most workers. Irish immigrants, many with combat experience, adapted to the plains, building miles of track daily while fending off raids, disease, and exhaustion. Freed African Americans sought opportunity amidst a dangerous landscape, contributing to the collective achievement with courage and tenacity. Together, this multinational workforce embodies the complexity of labor and migration in 19th century America. They were the hidden architects of progress, whose efforts forged the backbone of a nation. The story of the Transcontinental Railroad is not merely a tale of engineering triumph. It is a story of resilience, endurance, and the interdependence of human communities across cultural and geographic boundaries. The laborers, often unrecognized, faced extreme environmental challenges, brutal social hierarchies, and the constant threat of injury or death. They built tunnels, trestles, bridges, and track that spanned mountains, deserts, and rivers. They adapted, innovated, and persevered. Without their collective will and skill, the promise of a coast-to-coast railroad would have remained an unrealized dream, a vision confined to the drawing boards of politicians and engineers. The railroad also illustrates the broader tensions of American expansion. Indigenous nations saw the railroad as an existential threat, an instrument of displacement, and a harbinger of cultural annihilation. The tracks cut through hunting grounds, disrupted sacred landscapes, and presaged the arrival of settlers and military forces. Resistance was not only inevitable, but morally justified from the perspective of those whose lands were being seized. Meanwhile, the laborers building the railroad were themselves often marginalized, exploited, and denied recognition. They were caught between the promises of progress and the realities of oppression, their achievements largely invisible in the annals of history. By the time the two lines met at Promontory Summit in 1869, the railroad had transformed the United States. It reduced the perilous journey across the continent from months to mere days, linked remote regions to national markets, facilitated settlement, and cemented the United States' industrial and political power. Yet the true story, the story of human courage, ingenuity, and suffering, is largely untold. It is the story of the Chinese laborers who tunneled through the Sierras, the Irish workers who laid track across the plains, and the African Americans who sought new lives amidst daunting circumstances. It is the story of cooks, blacksmiths, and haulers who sustained the construction effort. It is a story that reminds us that progress is often built on the unrecognized labor of the marginalized, and that history is preserved not only in monuments and photographs, but in the scars left on the land and the lives of those who shaped it. In the American imagination, the story of the Transcontinental Railroad is often framed as a triumph of vision and enterprise, a tale of rail barons, tycoons, and a nation's boundless ambition. Yet, beneath the gilded veneer of golden spikes and executive photographs lies a story forged in sweat, grit, and unheralded labor. The steel rails stretching from coast to coast were not laid by the hands of celebrated figures in frock coats or top hats. They were hammered into place by men who labored under the harshest conditions, who were underpaid, undervalued, and often marginalized by the society that depended on them. These men, immigrants, freedmen, and laborers of every shade, did not build the railroad to leave their names in history. They built it to survive, to feed families, to carve out a life amid the chaos of a nation still healing from civil war and still pushing its boundaries westward. By the late 1860s, the two massive railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, were no longer simply laying tracks. They were locked in a fierce competition, each striving to outpace the other, each driven by federal incentives and the promise of enormous profit. The meeting point, somewhere in the remote deserts of Utah, loomed like a mythical finish line, invisible but intensely real. The government subsidies were structured to reward speed. For every mile of track completed, companies received both loans and federal land grants, often up to 640 acres per mile. Every additional mile translated into additional profit, making the stakes monumental. With this structure, both companies raced with near-manic determination, sometimes laying track in parallel directions, fully aware that only one would eventually remain in use. The frenzy was more than a competition. It was a battle for land, money, prestige, and historical immortality. The Central Pacific, having triumphed over the daunting Sierra Nevada, now faced the arid, merciless deserts of Nevada and Utah. Crews labored under relentless sun, carving pathways through dry, rocky terrain where water was scarce and temperatures swung between sweltering heat and freezing nights. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific advanced across the eastern plains, contending with wide rivers, sprawling grasslands, and the constant threat of violent conflict with indigenous peoples whose lands were being bisected. Every mile, every spike, every bridge represented not just progress but confrontation against nature, politics, and human resistance. Amid these extreme conditions, the labor force of the Central Pacific achieved feats of almost unimaginable efficiency and endurance. In April 1869, Chinese crews laid 10 meters of track in a single day, a record of precision and coordination that would remain unmatched even today. Teams worked in synchronized shifts, executing their tasks with rhythm and discipline honed by years of experience under punishing conditions. On the Union Pacific side, Irish laborers, veterans of famine and civil strife, advanced steadily, often facing strikes, logistical failures, and the mismanagement of Thomas Durant, a financier whose primary interests were stock manipulation and profit rather than engineering efficiency. Despite these obstacles, both crews pressed on relentlessly, driven by survival, ambition, and the promise of reward. Finally, the two lines approached convergence at Promontory Summit, Utah. Surveyors marked the ceremonial site, and arrangements were made for a historic celebration. The Central Pacific's Jupiter and the Union Pacific's number 119 locomotives were positioned nose to nose, cowcatchers almost touching. Executives prepared speeches, and a special golden spike was commissioned, inscribed with a blessing invoking divine unity for a nation stitched together by iron rails. Telegraph wires were connected to transmit the hammer's final blows to the rest of the country, signaling the completion of a dream that had taken years of planning, labor, and human sacrifice. Yet the ceremony obscured a far more complicated truth. The construction of the railroad had been brutal and often reckless. Profits, politics, and federal incentives had driven work at the expense of safety and human dignity. The rails had been joined, but the scars they left behind, on land, on communities, and on countless lives, were deep and lasting. Progress had a finish line, but the means of achieving it were harsh, chaotic, and morally complex. On May 10, 1869, Promontory Summit became the focal point of the nation. A crowd of workers, officials, journalists, and executives assembled to witness the culmination of years of labor and struggle. The two locomotives, gleaming under the desert sun, represented the Union Pacific and Central Pacific, two corporate titans whose competition had reshaped the continent. Between them lay the final rail, and at its center, the golden spike glimmered, engraved with a message of unity. May God continue the unity of our country as this railroad unites the two great oceans of the world. Telegraph lines connected the ceremonial hammer so that each strike would echo across the nation. When Leland Stanford lifted the sledgehammer, Americans everywhere seemed to lean closer, waiting for the symbolic act that would tie the country together. Church bells rang, cannons fired, and celebrations erupted from New York to San Francisco. The East and West were no longer months apart. They were now 7 days distant by rail. It was an extraordinary engineering and logistical achievement. Yet, for all the triumph, much of the workforce was absent from the photos and ceremonies that sought to define the historical narrative. The Chinese laborers, who had carried the heaviest burden through the Sierra Nevada, were excluded. Irish workers, African Americans, indigenous guides, cooks, blacksmiths, none were included in the frame. Instead, the image preserved for history showed white executives in frock coats, holding hammers and cigars, while the real heroes, whose toil had made the rails possible, remained invisible. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad transformed the United States almost overnight. Geography was compressed. The distance from coast to coast, once a treacherous 6-month journey, could now be traversed in 7 days. Goods, people, and information moved with unprecedented speed. Agricultural products from the Midwest, wheat, corn, and cattle, could now reach distant mining towns in the west or industrial cities in the east. Manufactured goods flowed in the opposite direction, fueling settlement and economic development. The iron rails replaced oxen, and steam replaced sail. Supply chains expanded, towns emerged along the tracks, and the rhythms of commerce became synchronized with the steady chug of locomotives. Railroad towns sprouted almost overnight. Some grew into permanent settlements. Others disappeared just as quickly when tracks shifted. Each town became a node in an intricate network, bound together by the pulse of steel, steam, and human labor. Industries linked to the railroad, ironworks, coal mines, timber mills, and steel production, boomed, creating jobs and wealth, albeit unevenly distributed. Rail barons, financiers, and entrepreneurs amassed fortunes, shaping national policy and consolidating power. The railroad became both a vehicle for economic growth and a symbol of concentrated corporate influence, exposing the intersections of capital, labor, and government. For individuals, the railroad created opportunity and movement on an unprecedented scale. Immigrants arriving in New York could now travel directly to California or Oregon, seeking land, labor, or fortune. Homesteaders, ranchers, prospectors, and outlaws all utilized the steel road to pursue their destinies. Yet this new mobility was intertwined with exploitation and displacement. Indigenous nations experienced the railroad as an existential threat. The tracks carved through the territories of the Lakota, Cheyenne, Shoshone, Ute, and many other tribes. Sacred grounds were violated, hunting patterns disrupted, and seasonal migrations curtailed. Buffalo, central to Plains cultures, diets, and economies, were hunted to near extinction to make way for trains and settlers. In some cases, passengers on trains were encouraged to shoot the animals from moving cars for sport. This ecological and cultural devastation accompanied the physical expansion of the railroads. The railroad was more than steel and timber. It was a force of transformation. It brought settlers, soldiers, surveyors, and commerce into previously remote areas. Homesteaders, supported by federal law, staked claims on lands that indigenous peoples had stewarded for generations. The presence of military garrisons ensured the protection of the railroad and suppression of resistance. Conflicts erupted, escalating into battles and wars, from Red Cloud's War to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Resistance was eventually crushed, and tribes were confined to reservations, far from their ancestral homelands. Sacred sites were desecrated, hunting patterns destroyed, and nomadic cultures forced into sedentary, surveilled lives. All of this was rationalized in the name of progress, national unity, and manifest destiny. Yet, despite the costs, the railroad reshaped the nation in profound ways. It accelerated commerce, facilitated migration, and integrated regional economies. Time itself was reorganized, leading to the establishment of time zones to coordinate schedules across the continent. Agriculture and industry could now operate on a national scale, transforming a fragmented republic into a continental power. Cities and towns adapted to the new rhythm of life dictated by steel rails and steam engines, linking local economies to global markets. Immigrants, laborers, and entrepreneurs all found new pathways to opportunity, even as indigenous peoples and the environment bore the burden of expansion. Culturally, the railroad reinforced the ideology of manifest destiny. The continent, once vast and daunting, now seemed traversable, claimable, and controlled. It fueled national ambition, encouraging settlement and exploitation, while cementing the vision of the United States as a continuous, interconnected entity stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. At the same time, it created unprecedented inequalities. Wealth concentrated in the hands of tycoons, indigenous lands were appropriated, laborers remained marginalized, and the environmental consequences were severe. The railroad was both a triumph and a tragedy, an instrument of connection and a tool of destruction. When the final spike was driven at Promontory Summit, it was more than the completion of a rail line. It was the beginning of a new American identity, one defined by speed, ambition, and industrial power. The country was no longer a collection of distant regions separated by wilderness. It was a single, integrated economic and political organism. The rails carried not just passengers and freight, but also ambition, power, and the transformation of the landscape itself. The Transcontinental Railroad stands as a testament to human ingenuity, endurance, and the complex, often painful, costs of progress. Through iron and fire, America was irrevocably changed.